And we're live. Welcome everybody to the chat, and welcome to everyone listening after the fact. I'm Random Acoustic Thoughts, aka Teep to the Junk. I've got two special guests here with me. Firstly, the boxing librarian from Hardline Boxing Talk. Welcome, BL. Thoughts on the project, my friend? Do you want to describe it to the people?
Yes, myself, my good friend Scrapbook, and my good friend Random are going to do a career comparison between Sam Langford and Harry Greb. It is one of the fabled matchups in boxing history because you're talking about two of greatest, well, who many people say have probably the two greatest resumes of all time. But it goes a bit deeper than that because other fighters have great resumes, Ray Robinson, Henry Armstrong, and so many others. But these two are almost mythical figures now in terms of what they did in their careers. Langford 300 plus and Harry Greb 300 plus if you count a certain few fights in there as well, under 300 if you don't. But yeah, two monumental careers and two guys who fought a ridiculous amount of opposition. So basically, I'm going to go straight into these 3 points, and then I will hand over to Scrapbook Boxing and then Random for their thoughts. But there's 3 main points I want to kick off in regards to these two, and I can't wait to hear the guys' opinions on my thoughts on it. One of them is who is the greatest puncher? I mean, that clearly to me is Sam Langford. Sam Langford is probably pound for pound, not based on individual weight class, but just pound for pound, based on size, is probably one of the greatest punchers, probably one of top 3 hardest punchers of all time. Obviously, I don't think he quite hit as hard as Ernie Shavers, but Ernie Shavers was a very big man. Langford punched very hard for his weight. He had formidable power. So I think in terms of the punch power and being a puncher and record as a puncher, Langford clearly wins. There's a second point I want to mention, and that is when you compare careers, you have to compare the weights they moved. I also, again, have to give this to Sam Langford. I have searched for many years for the fabled featherweight fight before he fought McVicker in 1902. I have not managed to find it as yet, and I have done a lot of searching over the years, believe me, and I've never found this fabled heavyweight fight. But some people may have heard me say he moved from feather to heavyweight, and other times I'll say lightweight to heavyweight. I don't like having that quandary there, but in terms of the weight move, even though Harry Greb turned pro around 140, 141 pounds, which is just pretty much a light welterweight at the limit now. And then over those first 18 months, he morphed and blended into a light middleweight. Langford's weight move cannot be compared by Harry Greb, sadly. Langford's move from those lower weights, and even being a shorter fighter than Greb, he wasn't even as tall as Greb. The weight move clearly, like the punch power, goes to Sam Langford. But then in my point, the third point and final point before I enter Scrapbook is, after Langford to me wins as the greater puncher and the greater weight mover, we then go on to activity. Now, even though Langford had more fights, I cannot find any fighter in boxing history. I've found many fighters who had a lot of fights in a year. Take Kid Lewis, Johnny Dundee. Many fighters have had a lot of fights in a short time. But Harry Greb to me wins the activity, how active they were, because he pretty much fit the same size career of Langford in half the time. Okay, in only just over a dozen years, he amassed a virtual 300-fight career, whereas Langford fighting from 1902 to 1926, even Langford, even with the crazy fight runs, the crazy opposition he fought, even Sam Langford cannot match Harry Greb on being an active fighter, on constantly being in and out of the ring, taking fights non-stop. Harry Greb's years like 1917, 1919, 1918, and other years were just crazy years. In some years, I think Langford fought tougher opposition, tougher fight runs. But to me, Harry Greb wins the overall activity aspect. He was a much more active fighter. Like I say, if you have virtually the same fight total, but in half the number of years, you are fighting a lot because Sam Langford fought a lot. So for Greb to match his fight total in half the years, it is quite incredible. So those are 3 things I wanted to mention out of the bat. Being a great puncher goes to Langford. The weight move goes to Langford. The activity and the just relentless fighting goes to Harry Greb. So Langford wins 2 out of 3. But what I'll do now is hand over to Scrapbook Boxing to get his thoughts on my first 3 points before we go into the main career.
Thank you, BL. It's a pleasure being on this platform with you once again. Random, the same. And we couldn't be talking about 2 greater fighters with somewhat contrast styles to bring a platform like this to light. And I agree with you with your selections on the greatest puncher and the career weights and activities. I have to say you're spot on. The only thing with the Sam Langford with activity was we all know he didn't get some of the opportunities that Harry Greb might have gotten, although Harry Greb was struck by a lot of fighters as well. But Sam Langford, he could have possibly had some more activity had he not been shut down because of the race situation. So just to set that aside, but what he has done, you're absolutely right. Harry Greb has a better activity rate than Sam Langford, for what that's worth. What I want to say is, we have to keep in mind as we go through this that Sam Langford, obviously the time that he came, who he was, the era that he fought in, the men who avoided him, we have to keep that in consideration when we look at the side-by-side activities, because it does play a major factor. We don't know what would have happened had he fought those men, but he didn't get the opportunity to fight them for us to be able to make a fair comparison to who, let's say, for instance, Harry Greb faced Gene Tunney. Sam Langford didn't get that opportunity, so we don't know what would have happened in that fight. So just some side notes there as we go through some of these fights. I just wanted to be very careful how I made my selections on what I think would have happened or who had a better reign during that particular year. But spot on, BL, spot on.
If I don't know if I could just jump in, Scrapbook. You have raised a very, very good point there, though, and something that both you and I have spoke about at length: the colour line. And to all the listeners out there, we have to remember that Sam Langford tried to fight Jimmy Britt. He wanted to fight Fitzsimmons. He tried to fight Marvin Hart. He tried to fight Papke. He tried to fight Tommy Burrs. He tried to fight so many fighters and didn't get the chance. Now, Harry Greb was not quite tied into that. I mean, yes, he was turned down and told he'd be arrested if he did try to fight Jack McVeigh on Independence Day. Okay, because Harry Greb wanted to fight him. Jack McVeigh were a feared middleweight contender, and Greb said, "I'll fight him and I'll whip him." You know, and he wanted to fight him, but he was told, "No, if the fight goes ahead on Independence Day, you're going to get arrested. Police will break it up and you'll get arrested." So the fight, he couldn't go through. And Greb did give opportunity. He did fight many of those fighters who other fighters wouldn't fight, like Tiger Flowers and Kid Norfolk. But Greb did not face. That is a very good point. Greb did not face the colour line. He did not face peril during his career of being killed if he potentially did too well and beat some young starlet too badly. So that also, quite rightly, as Scrapbook says, has to be factored. Langford didn't get opportunities for the middleweight title. He didn't get opportunities for a light heavyweight title. He didn't get an opportunity for the main heavyweight title. He lost out on the opportunity for a lightweight title with Joe Gans. But yeah, there's so many fighters who clearly didn't want to go anywhere near Sam Langford. Sullivan brothers as well, Mike and Jack Sullivan, they wanted no part of him. There's just so many fighters you can list who Langford pursued and didn't get. I mean, in fairness to Greb, a number of fighters he didn't get fights with either. You know, Jack Delaney, Berlenbach, Georges Carpentier. Greb at one point were even trying to get a fight with Battling Siki for light heavyweight title, but that didn't work out. But, you know, he didn't face the level of avoidance that Langford faced. And I think that is a very good point Scrapbook raised.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff, guys. So I'm not going to add too much because I agree with you guys on those points. You know, Langford, one of the most ferocious punchers. He didn't have the same mass behind his punches, but his accuracy, his long arms, his gigantic chest propelled some pretty vicious shots. So if you're talking about pounds per square inch and the ability to put him on a chin, he's right up there all time. And he had one-shot power. He could hit from, like Joe Louis, like Jack Blackburn tried to get his student Joe Louis, you know, up to Langford levels of being able to hit from any distance, any angle, any position. And he did. You know, I don't know if he got to Langford level. I don't know if Blackburn ever gave him the full credit, but I know that was the comparison. That was the top operator, although Lewis was larger than Langford, so he was able to fight a little bit differently. But I think, I think with the activity of Greb, like he was avoided because he was so ferocious in there, but he wasn't a knockout artist. He would smash a guy up, humiliate them, drain them. So it's a different kind of threat than Langford, but it did scare off some guys. Both guys were avoided but they fought in such ridiculously rich eras. They were like the kings of guys getting shut out of opportunity. They got a little bit of opportunity, but not on the scale, proportionate to their talent, to their ability and their resumes. But
just very quickly,
yes, sir.
If I may jump in, very passionate topic this for me. But in terms of Sam Langford, I had a nutcase come on my channel the other day and try arguing with me that Gene Tunney is a greater fighter than Sam Langford, and Gene Tunney accomplished more and beat all these names. And I didn't even get into a debate with him, because when someone says that, it's clearly obvious they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, I found offensive that he was making out that Gene Tunney, fought a high level of opposition like Langford. People would have to go back and ask why Gene Tunney flatly refused to fight the heavyweight punching machine George Godfrey in mid-1920s. I mean, Gene Tunney ran away from Godfrey, like the Roadrunner. If Godfrey showed up, he would have meep, and he would gone in a puff of smoke. He wanted no part of George Godfrey. He wanted no part of Kid Norfolk. Kid Norfolk called Tunney out a whole number of times. At one point, there would even talk of Tunney fighting Tiger Flowers in earlier 20s. But, ultimately, Gene Tunney didn't fight black fighters. So I'm very sorry, but don't anyone ever compare him to Sam Langford. Langford fought across the colour line. He fought the great black fighters, many of them. He also fought fighters like Jack O'Brien, a great light heavyweight. He also fought Stanley Ketchel. Tunney did not do the same. So now we'll get back on topic, but I just wanted to mention that. Please, no one come to me with this Gene Tunney as great as Sam Langford talk, because Gene Tunney fought from only a portion of the available pool, and many dangerous fighters like Wills, Godfrey, Norfolk, Flowers, all these other guys, Siki, they were all barred from facing Gene Tunney. So, unless Gene Tunney fought across the colour bar, I ain't even going to have him in a conversation with Sam Langford. Or Harry Greb, for that matter.
That's totally reasonable. Now, I was thinking, gentlemen, a good place for us to start, now we've done the intro, is just the early career. We're talking about, because their careers started off differently. They hit the highest levels of competition at different paces. Scrapbook, do you maybe want to talk about, like, maybe some of the differences you see in the first couple years of their career, like the way they came into the craft?
Well, yes, Sam Langford, 1902, he would have an amateur bout. I'm not sure how many amateur bouts he actually had, but he would win the amateur featherweight championship. Then he would turn professional. So he carried out the entire 1903 with heavy hitters, with fighters such as Joe Gans. I mean, when you do that, and he was 17 years old when he did that. When you look at Harry Greb, and I want to say this because I believe this to be true. So we all have Sam Langford and Harry Greb, number 1 and number 2.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So you understand the parallels that we're working with here. With Harry Greb, he was stopped by Joe Chip in his 8th professional fight in the 2nd round in a fashion where he just wasn't aware of what was happening. Not taking credit away from Harry Greb, but just to show you, when you look at Sam Langford's opposition early on and Harry Greb's opposition early on, Sam Langford went head on with some of the top names that he was able to fight in 1903. When you look at Harry Greb, he started his career in 1913, but when you look at the competitors that he had facing him for the first 4, 5, 6, 7 fights, I would say that Sam Langford took on a little more heavier hitters than Harry Greb early in his career.
I think that is a great point, Scrapbook, because like you said quite rightly about Joe Chip, when Greb fought Joe Chip, I think it was towards the end of 1913, wasn't it? He was taken out in 2 rounds, and he was taken out by a right hand, a right hook in corner. As the story goes from people at ringside who interviewed Greb afterwards, he actually got out of the ring. And he would outside at ring, and he would ask him, what happened? What happened? What went on? He didn't even know he'd been stopped. Of course, then 2 years later, he was stopped for the 2nd and final time in his career against Perry Graves when he fractured his wrist, I believe. He had a double fracture in his wrist, a very painful injury. He couldn't continue. But yeah, I think Greb turned pro, and it wasn't really until 1915 when he was fighting Billy Miss, etc., before he really stepped up that opposition, fighting Blackburn, Misk, and then going to Gibbons and fighters like this. I agree that, you know, in turning pro in 1902, limited experience 1902, but then in 1903, jumping straight through to fighting, it's probably one of the top 3 greatest lightweights of all time. End of that first full calendar year, yeah, I definitely agree with Scrapbook that Sam Langford got into the opposition quicker and tougher. And following the Gans fight were fights with Blackburn, Holly. These were really, really tough fighters. So I agree with Scrapbook 100%. Sorry, Scrapbook, I didn't mean to jump in.
No, I appreciate it. And that was my point. And at his age, at 17, and he, you know, he's did it at lightweight. And of course, he's going to eventually move as high as heavyweight. But he took whatever challenges were the best opposition at that time. He was pointing in that direction, and he did very well for himself. He just unfortunately didn't make the weight for Joe Gans, but he would win that fight. And I just think he had a better start than Harry Greb did coming in his first couple of fights.
Yeah, can I throw another point in there? Sorry, guys, I'm really passionate about this topic.
Go right ahead, sir.
Another great point to back up what Scrapbook said there. Another point on the weight move, what I mentioned earlier, and to back Scrap, he went through, you know, the tougher opposition quicker. A lot of people don't realise that, you know, he was born in 1886. Okay, he fought Joe Gans. He wasn't even 18 years old yet. So basically, from that fight with Gans in 1903, by 1906, he'd already fought across the weights from lightweight to heavyweight, because when he fought Johnson in 1906, he went for a coloured heavyweight title. Yeah, Langford were outweighed by 29 pounds. But he fought fighters across numerous weights in only that short period. You know, from his first full year, yeah, he fought McVicker first and got ominously a stoppage, ominous things to come. But, you know, that first full year, 1903, you know, to 1906, we're talking, he was nearly 21 years old, and he'd already fought across that weight gap from lightweight to heavyweight, fighting fighters in different weights. That is incredible, and just backs up Scrapbook's point that Sam Langford definitely started off faster and harder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look across, you know, I guess Langford had that stop and start. You know, he had the amateur fights and the turn pro, beat the former amateur opponent, McVicker. He had a couple other bookings that year, but they don't appear to have happened. I found results for the cards, but those fights weren't featured in the results. They didn't happen for whatever reason. But starting in 1903, it was on. You know, he made. I found a fight that I hadn't seen anywhere. Young Jarvis, that happened after the second bout with Luther Manuel, that I believe in February. I put in parentheses because I can't quite remember the date, and I didn't have time to look it up. I think it was the 21st. But anyway, so he had 28 trips to the ring that year. So Gans was his 27th fight of the year, and then he had one more before the year was out. It's like against Jack Blackburn, a top lightweight. What's interesting is the year following this, the 1904 season, Joe Gans, to some degree Jack Blackburn, Dave Hawley, Sam Langford, they were all up fighting at welterweight. Gans was also fighting at lightweight, but Gans challenged Barbados Walcott, Langford challenged Barbados Walcott. Langford and Hawley fought in a title shot eliminator around the same time that Gans and Walcott were fighting. They were going to fight the winner, but then everyone drew. And the Gans-Walcott fight became a non-title fight last minute, but then both fights were draws, so it didn't happen. Then Walcott shot himself in the hand.
Another good point about 1904 is the fight run he had, where he fought Dave Ollie, that went 10 rounds. He fought George McFadden. Then he fought Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, 15-round fight. That was a tough fight. Followed those 3 fights up with another 2 fights with Dave Ollie that went over 20 rounds combined. So you're talking about 3 fights with Dave Ollie, Barbados Walcott, and George Elbows McFadden, all on the trot in only his second full year as a pro. I mean, that is major league opposition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's a great point. And once again, as we look at the fighters and the time in which they came, they didn't have what you have now. They had somewhat backwood rules, if you will. They didn't have opportunities to recover from a bruised hand. They didn't have opportunities to recover from a bruised eye or even a cut eye. They had to go right in there. The rules were different. The amount of rounds that they fought were different. There were no decision contests in certain states. So there were totally different circumstances. mentally that they had to deal with when they went into that ring. So between those two men, it's really amazing how parallel they are when it comes to that. But with Sam Langford, like we said, the first couple of years, I think he just got a faster start. And also because of the opportunities that he may have had or may not have had, it's pretty impressive to me.
Yeah, and he was already being avoided and considered a top guy. By like 1905, he's like a top shelf competitor, but he's fighting above his weight quite often. So there's still questions about whether he can win. I mean, he fights Joe Jeanette in 1905, and it's like he's in no position to be fighting even a small heavyweight at that point. But he's got a
Yeah,
ton
and
of
Jeanette
experience in his
actually,
game for it.
Jeanette in that fight, Langford were dominating first 4 rounds, but in second half of fight, Jeanette started working body and head, started going to body and then mixing it up to head as well, and started coming forward and attacking Langford, and he stopped him. I mean, it was an incredible result, really, for a fairly inexperienced Joe Jeanette at that time. But we also have to remember, you know, in saying that he's going in with George Coles and Jack Johnson 7 times in his first, so he had a tough start. But 1905 for Langford again. There's another fight run. Check this. Young Peter Jackson, Baltimore Demon, young Peter Jackson, Larry Temple, Jack Blackburn, Larry Temple, Jack Blackburn, young Peter Jackson, and Joe Jeanette, all on the trot. I mean, that is a 9-fight run that is just incredibly hard. Probably totaling over 100 rounds in a 9-fight run on the trot. 3 fights with young Peter Jackson, 2 fights with Jack Blackburn, fight with Joe Jeanette, 2 fights with Larry Temple, who were a game come forward fighter. He could handle himself. So, you know, yeah, definitely Langford's off at the races.
Yeah, 100%. Sorry, I had to duck out for a second. My 1905 graphic didn't load. There we go. They took long enough. I want to make sure everyone gets to see all of them. Yeah, his strength of competition just got tougher and tougher. You know, Larry Temple was rival of Barbados Walcott. He was like the protege of Walcott's ex-manager, O'Rourke. So he was the guy who was supposed to take out the Barbados Wonder and take over the welterweight bracket. But yeah, he got the best of Langford, gave him his, what would that be, Langford's 3rd loss? He lost in 1903 to Danny Duane.
He lost in 1904 to Dave Ollie.
Yep, and then 1905 he lost to Larry Temple. Then he drew with him before.
And then he lost to Jeanette at end of year. Yeah. Christmas Day, right, if I recall.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's a season right there. You know, they didn't even break till Boxing Day, the day after. But and then Langford's, I guess I'll go into 1906, then we'll loop back to Greb's, you know, 3rd and 4th year.
Right before you go to 1906, can I just bring out a point? I apologize.
Oh, please, sir.
Out a point. Back in 1905, he would win the colored middleweight championship title from young Peter Jackson. Well, he would basically solidify it with young Peter Jackson. And I thought that was very, very impressive because here's a young man who's feeling his way around the circuit, and he's taking on all the challenges. He wants to immediately become the elite fighter at that tender age. And with all the obstacles in front of him, he was short of getting the lightweight championship title. He was short of getting the welterweight championship title. So he wanted to shoot for an opportunity for the middleweight, although it wasn't the established middleweight championship title, but it was a title, and that was young Peter Jackson in 1905. I believe it was May 26th. I could be wrong, but I believe that was the
date. Yeah, the 15-rounder. Yeah.
15-rounder, yes. So these are little things to look at when you take a look at, as we will be looking at Harry Greb, but as we look at Sam Langford, very impressive, very impressive.
Yeah, this was a particularly tough year. I mean, because like has already been suggested, you know, if you don't have recovery time, you get banged up. So like in Langford's debut year, he beat the great Joe Gans, but he also got beaten by, you know, the fast hands of Danny Duane, New York area lightweight. But of course that was like, I think his 19th or something like that, roughly his 19th fight of the year. So at some point, you know, you meet a bad style matchup and you're already banged up, or you're just sore, or you're just been out celebrating having money for once. Because, you know, he was only a few months into having money at that point.
And also, even at that young age in 1905, I think it was in 1905. Was it in 1905 where Langford broke his hand or broke his wrist against George Gunther in one of their fights, and he controlled rest that fight. I'm trying to remember which fight it was, whether it was 1905 or the fight in 1906. But even at that young age, He'd already built vast experience fighting great legends like Walcott and Gans and all these other tough fighters, Ollie Blackburn, you know, the Baltimore Demon, etc. But even at that young age, he's not even 21 years old yet. He still showed the smarts when he's injured to fight his way through a fight and do what he needs to do to get the win, which he did. So he's also showing a high level of maturity at that age. And another thing I'd like to point out is that Langford demonstrated that from the Gans fight to the Walcott fight, because he fought in a very different way, because he realized he were fighting a different opponent with a different style. Sorry, my throat's going. And that also shows an incredible adaptability at a young age.
Yes, absolutely. And in 1906, he fractured his hand again when he took on Joe Jeanette. He defeated him in 12 rounds. 2 weeks later is when he took on Jack Johnson. And that fight went 15 full rounds, although he was dropped in the 6th and the 9th. But once again, very impressive to me with Sam Langford, willing to take on the top challengers, still fairly early in his career. And the men that he's facing are all legends, Hall of Famers. You know, the Jack Johnsons and the Joe Jeanettes. Very impressive to me what Sam Langford has done his first couple of years as a professional.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Langford did have setbacks, but he was aiming so high that, you know, there's a certain level where even if you're magnificent, even if like he was by 1905, 1906, everyone knew for his weight, he was the hot stuff on the whole planet. But the question was, could he beat these guys who had a size advantage on him? Because it's sizes, there's a reason they're weight classes. It's not to protect the big guys. But so in 1906, especially, he had the loss to Jack Johnson, but he got cheered by the crowd for lasting, you know, the 15 rounds. And then he had an exhibition after that, but then he loses his next proper fight to, you know, the aforementioned young Peter Jackson, who was a great puncher, but also a really good wrestler. Like I've seen writers complaining in the articles that he was too good at slowing fights down. So it was like he had a little of that Bernard Hopkins capability. When Bernard wants to slow a fight down, it's going to slow down. So he was like that, but he had wrestling, but he was a puncher. And, you know, Langford, I think, got TKO'd in that fight. Then he took a few months off. And when he came back at the end of 1906, he wouldn't suffer an official loss until the end of 1911 after that, after the young Peter Jackson fight. But he would lose a newspaper decision to fireman Jim Flynn, you know, 36 fights after the young Peter Jackson fight. But it was all wins or draws for a long time. And then, you know, even with the Jim Flynn fight, I'm getting a little bit ahead of the discussion here, but just I'll say he was thought that he carried him. And then in the long fight, 5 weeks later, they're booked for 45 rounds instead of 10, and he stopped him in the 8th. He put the full thing on him because there's a bigger purse. Because the money politics goes into this. The schedule these guys kept, this is about money, lifestyle, opportunity. And, you know, even if Langford couldn't get as big opportunities as other people, he couldn't get those giant paydays like Jack Johnson, or even like Tommy Burns got 30 grand, a record 30,000 guaranteed to defend against Johnson. You know, like the color line was one thing, it was a real thing, but money solves a lot of problems. When money gets big enough, guys got over it. Stanley Ketchel got over it, fought Johnson, then got over it again and fought Langford. You know, money changes people's minds. But, you know, Langford didn't get opportunities, but he was tough enough and good enough. And he was also plugged in. You know, like in his, maybe that's part of the, what do you guys think? Part of the toughness of his, hold on, Scrapbook. The toughness of his early career, partly because he's plugged in with the Lennox Club, so he can fight there 10 or whatever times in his first full season, as well as all the other clubs in the area. So he had like extra opportunity early on before he was feared and avoided. So it's kind of, you know, he was fast rising, but then, you know, the impediment of just being too good. So he got one of his nicknames, Begging Sam, because he was really trying to get work and get opportunities. And he'd be like, hey, we can go easy at first. In fact, I'll save that for later. Let's do Harry Greb's incredible 19, maybe 16 and 17. Is that roughly where we're at for him right now?
Well, there's one point I'd like to get into before we go on to that, and that is Langford showed at a young age he was very experienced and very adaptable to different fighters and different styles, and he showed he had the intellect to be able to recognize that I'm in with Walcott, not Gans. I need to fight a different way. Left jab, left hook, move out to left. Try and keep Walcott off centre, so he, away from those brutal left hooks, them leaping in left hooks. And he fought a different way, and he showed experience, and he fought through the weights. Harry Greb also had a bit of a change over those first few years. When he first turned professional, he was more of a brawler. He was more of a Tony Zale type fighter. He hadn't really morphed into what became known as the jumping jack top yet. Again, like Langford, that came with experience. When Greb were going into 1915, he were, when he were fighting fighters like Blackburn and Billy Misk, he also then started to pick up elite level experience fighting future Hall of Fame fighters. And Greb morphed his style. And I always struggle to remember which Willie Brennan fight it was, but there was a fight he had against Willie Brennan, and before fight, Greb announced, basically, look, I'm just going to go in there and punch until he drops. And they were like, oh, crazy, Addy, you've got to pace yourself. He said, no, I'm going to go in there and punch him non-stop till he drops. And after 5 or 6 rounds, he thought, oh, I should have been tired, but I won. I can keep going. And he kept going. And that brought a change in him because he realized that his fanatical, engine he had, that great stamina he had. Langford had other traits as well, but Harry Greb had like one of legendary natural engines in boxing history. He could just punch like a whirlwind. Like when later he fought Augie Ratner, the fight were very, very close after 18 rounds, and Greb realized, I need to go out and put everything to wind, and he came out throwing punches like a madman in rounds 19 and 20 and took the point verdict. So he also morphed from one style, and his style started to morph into another style where he'd move around more. He'd move left, he'd move right, he'd jump in, he'd barrage, he'd tie you up, he'd bite your glove, he'd bite you on the shoulder, he'd headbutt you, he'd thumb you in. He'd do whatever he had to do. He'd bounce out, move around, and his style morphed as well as he started fighting better fighters, and the style changed into something that many of the fighters he fought in 1916, 17 suddenly had major trouble dealing with, because he was so quick and agile, and he's such herky-jerky movement. He was very hard to tag clean, and combined with that great engine, it's kind of like that old saying, if you throw 150 punches around and your opponent's throwing 50 around, and your opponent's finding it hard to land their punches, you're pretty much going to win the rounds. So Harry Greb realized, he could punch as well. Just ask Buck Kraus. He could punch very hard, but he never really set. He was constantly moving. He was constantly pivoting. So he didn't set his power down to let power shots go. But obviously, like I said, Buck Kraus, he could punch really hard. But that's something important to mention on Greb's early development as well. The change in style, just like Langford showed certain traits there, Greb also showed that he could adapt and morph his style into something that'd be more effective for him based on his physical abilities.
That's an excellent point. It's like Greb weaponized his cardio and aggression and creativity. He was like a jazz musician. He was improv in there, but guys couldn't keep up with him. Lots. BL, in your video, your updated 2022 testimonials on Greb, these guys are like, you just can't figure him out. You never catch up to him. And he never passes the ball. He never lets you get set and do your thing. Tunney, as a very studious person. Now, I'm not talking about the little home cooking decision in the second fight, but later in their series, Tunney, with all his studiousness, was able to actually, make it more competitive. He was able to do well, and especially in the last fight. But, Greb could when Greb was in his prime, when he had all his physical capabilities, because of course that was later in his career, the later fights. But he could weaponize cardio. He was very unique. Like, you can't just become a Harry Greb. Similarly, you can't just become a Sam Langford. You can't, because think about someone with his size chest. It's like 44 inches before he sticks it out there. But he's 5'7.5" as a grown man, so it's like, so he has these gigantic shoulders, long arms, a huge chest like Sonny Liston, like that kind of size chest on a little short guy. But he's also very nimble and agile, and he's very experienced. And he had good training. Jimmy Walsh, the talented bantamweight, basically the top bantamweight in New England at the time Langford was coming up. Bob Armstrong at some point came in, former colored heavyweight champion. You've both done material on Bob Armstrong, 2-weight colored champion, very clever fighter. And so Langford had a lot of advantages, even though later it would sting him that he was too good. He got that good in part because he had good people around him. He had opportunity for bookings. it was later when people realized just how good he was that other people didn't want to look bad against him. They didn't want to go in because Langford had a chin. He showed in that Johnson fight, even though he got his butt kicked and he got his eye closed. He showed he was there for it. Like, he was tough. He didn't get put away by a 30 pounds heavier, reigning colored heavyweight champion. So pretty crazy, you know. Like, but he had the stones. You know, Langford had a lot of guts. And so did Greb. These guys were, you know, you have to have a lot of guts if you lose an eyesight in one eye and you're still fighting at a high level. Both these guys did it. They had no right fighting at the end. They could never get cleared today. So, but they were very unique. It was my original point. Greb weaponized his cardio and his creativity. Langford used his frame combined with his experience. He'd seen it all. And he'd seen it all at a speed faster than the heavyweights could throw at him. So later on, even if you hit hard, you're not moving like Joe Gantz. But there's Langford on the second from the left there next to Bob Armstrong. Look how long those arms are. Cartoonishly long for his height. You know, he's got 6'2" wingspan, but he's 5'7.5". And he knew how to use that, and he was teak tough. So I just wanted to ramble on those couple things. Let's go back to Greb. How about Scrapbook? What happened? What was Harry Greb doing in 1916? Oh my goodness. We know what Langford was doing. He was having the toughest season probably in history. But what was Harry Greb doing in 1916?
Sam Langford, what he came from when he came from Canada, he was a young man who got himself into some trouble, as young men do. His father pretty much tried to straighten him out, would beat him a lot. He would come over to this country, land in Boston, somewhere around the age of 14 or so, 14-ish, 15-ish, and he went to work immediately. And not just saying boxing, but he was scrubbing the decks of ships. He was mowing the lawn, if you will, with this held hand contraption behind mules. You know, he was a very tough-minded young man, never quit attitude. You know, take it out on the issues that he was dealing with, on the circumstance in front of him. So coming into boxing, that's what he knew. That's how he handled his frustrations. So you have a man like that in front of you, going from weight to weight. This is why a lot of people feared him. As far as Harry Greb is concerned, Harry Greb was probably one of the guys who, not saying he was unpredictable, but he would do whatever it took to win. And what was incredible about that, he only lost.
Sorry, we seem to have lost Scrapbook there.
Yeah, oh goodness, he cut out. Okay, Scrap, if you can hear us, you might have to come back in, or maybe your mic got muted on accident. Hopefully it's not a thing where we can't hear it, BL, but it's still on the stream. We're all talking over each other. But yeah, like Scrap was saying, like he came, both these guys were super tough when they came into the game. And they started hard, and they fought a schedule that, you know, today, like they've honed in how to maximize someone's fame in this space.
Even the mighty Sam Langford himself has, and people know how I rate Langford, but even the mighty Sam Langford himself, over those years, 1917 to 1920, even Sam Langford's resume has a match in Harry Greb. Langford started out way quicker. Greb in his mid-career from 1917 to 1921. I mean, his fight schedule was insane. I mean, when he lost to Mike Gibbons, you know, early 1917, he didn't lose again until after his 45-0 record year. You know, he went nearly, I calculated once, nearly 127 fights with only one official loss. I mean, just a crazy run when you consider that in one period, I think it was 41 days in 1917, he beat 3 Hall of Famers, all over 10-round decisions in 41 days. Jeff Smith, Jerome Jeffords, who was always a tough handful on his day. Jack Dillon were at great light heavyweight champions, and battling Levinsky, another great light heavyweight fighter. So he beat 3 Hall of Fame fighters in 41 days, and that's only in 1917. Langford had good runs as well, but we must also remember Greb had a lot of good runs as well. I mean, some of his activity is crazy. You know, like at one point, he fought Bob Mohar, Mike O'Dowd, Jack Dillon, and Mike Mateague all on the trot. So both of these guys had incredible fight runs where they'd often fight insane opposition on a year-to-year basis.
That was? Let's see if we can find that.
It was 1918, I believe it was.
Look at these years. These are seasons right here. This is like a legit season, a sporting season, rather than just a handful of fights. Yeah, look at that. Mohar, Dowd, Dillon, Mateague. That is mental. Yeah, I don't know who wins the battle of who had the craziest seasons, BL.
Can I also point out as well, that fight total there is not much shorter than Errol Spencer's entire multi-year career in terms of fight. It's only 4 or 5 fights shy of Errol Spencer's entire career.
Yeah, and we won't unleash 1919 on it yet because I know we're back on 16. Scrap, welcome back. You were saying about Greb's tough upbringing?
Yes. I don't know how far I got before I was cut off with this, but I can tell you this. His mental fortitude is what got him to where he was because of his upbringing, because of the circumstance that he had to face when he was coming up. When he came to Boston, when he was given jobs to do, he did them. Scrubbing the decks by hands and knees with a scrub brush. You know, that kind of a thing. So when he faced the man, it was nothing to him. In fact, he wanted to take revenge against those circumstances. Harry Greb the same way. So you're looking at 2 men who did whatever it took to win. They didn't see the fear like the average man would see the fear because of the circumstances they were in. So Harry Greb, when you look at the years, you just showed 1916. Sam Langford had a great year in 1916 as well. But these men took on the challenges per year, whoever the top dog was. He was in the ring with Faye Kaiser 9 times. Faye Kaiser fought in the AEF, America's Expeditionary Forces, in 1919, the same year that Jack Dempsey was in the ring with Jess Willett and won the World Championship title. And Faye Kaiser took on Fighting Bob Martin as a heavyweight. And Harry Greb was in the ring with this man 9 times. So it just goes to show you the mentality that these men had. It's really incredible. And as you show the different years and the opponents within those years that both men were facing and the circumstances, and if you even look around the surrounding circumstances of those years, what was going on, it's absolutely mind-blowing when you really look at it from a different set of lenses as to what these men dealt with. Incredible. It really is. It's fascinating.
Yeah, another point I'd like to jump in as well. Again, kind of going off on what Scraps mentioned there about the will to win. Both of these guys, like Scraps says, had an indomitable will to win. I mean, Harry Greb would fight anybody at drop of an hat. If he were in the city and he took 2 fights in 7 days, he heard there were another young fighter coming up, he'd say, I'll fight him before I go. Even if it were 3 days later, he didn't care. You know, Sam Langford as well, the same way. They just wanted to fight. They had this will to prove they were the best. Because, you know, from a lot of interviews and newspaper articles I've read back in time about Sam Langford, he also had that incredible will to win. He just wanted to fight any fighter who thought they could beat him. And he wanted to fight every fighter who was viewed as being the best fighter around any given city or any given weight. He just wanted to fight them all. And Harry Greb was exactly the same. You know, Greb's style described by one person as the manly art of modified murder. You know, he had a very different style to Sam Langford, but they were both effective styles. You know, I can't really give advantage in career to either guy because Greb used his tools to his effect, his speed, his reflexes, his endurance, and his everything like that regarding his style. And Langford, his speed, his footwork, his great hooks, his great uppercuts, his punch selection, his body punching. You know, they're both were very guilish fighters. You know, Langford often, you know, fighting big heavyweights, he'd often say that, you know, he'd just stand and wait for the right shoulder to move, and then he'd step in and fire short right hooks. He'd step in, putting all his power behind it. And as the opponent cocked the right hand to throw and leant forward, if that right hook from Langford caught him on chin, I mean, it was good night. You see him with Vienna Boys Choir, you know, and he used to time that. And he had a great left hook as well, you know, like the one he wiped out Wills with, you know, that 3-punch combo, that big sweeping left hook that just wiped Wills out. You know, Harry Wills saying what a ferocious body puncher Sam Langford was. That, you know, when he hit you to body, you just wanted to roll up on floor. They hurt that bad. So they both had incredible tools that enabled them to be successful. But they both, I think that we all alluding to as well, they both had fought tough opposition by midpoint of their careers. So they're both incredibly experienced. Whereas a fighter now like a Jamal Charlo, he hasn't mixed in that company. So, you know, when he's going in with really experienced fighters, it can be a shock. But at this point, you know, mid-career for both men, neither one have any fear. Greb feared no one, and if you know, like Jack Thompson, he tried to intimidate Langford. He went to the middle of the ring, and he said, "I'm going to knock you out." And Sam Langford just laughed at him and said, "When I hit you, you're going out." And he did. He knocked him out. But they both faced that fear, and they just didn't care. They you know, I always say that, you know, people say, "Oh, what had happened with, you know, Monzon, Hagler, Hopkins versus Greb?" I'm like, well, Greb would just laugh in the face. He'd want to fight them all in 3 weeks. He wouldn't care. He'd fight them all in 10 rounders over 3 weeks. He wouldn't care. Win, lose, he wouldn't care. But he would go in there and try and batter them silly. And he would do everything he could to win. And if he lost, you know, like many times in his career, he would be across the ring at the end of the fight demanding a rematch, saying, "I can beat you next time." You know, they both had that incredible will to win. I can't really favour it for either fighter. They both used the tools very well, and they both had an incredible will to win.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just want to say, with Harry Greb was just that intimidating factor. He just didn't care who the man was. He didn't care what the man did the fight before. Didn't matter to him. We look at Sam Langford. He would walk into the ring with a picnic basket. He would walk into the ring with 3 or 4 oranges in a 15-round fight. Yeah, so why is it 15 oranges? Because all I need is 4 oranges. That's the kind of boldness this man had. Really incredible characters when you think about them. These two men were
it's funny you mentioned that, Scott. I always remember that old story. Guy comes out and Langford puts his fists out. And Guy touches Gus saying, "What are you doing? It's not last round." He goes, "For you it is." And he knocked him out about 40 seconds into that round.
Yes. Yes,
and when Ash Langford said, I was bored, I didn't want to fight that guy 12 rounds, so he just knocked him out. Incredible. And when he walked around the ring, says, "Sorry, ladies and gents, I hope you don't mind if it's a quick night, but I have a train to catch." So he knocked the guy out in 1 round and rushed out of the ring. He got his train. I mean, these are great stories, like Harry Greb, you know, guys who were attacking his car. And there were a bunch of guys, and he jumped them in the street and had this big street brawl with him, and he battered them senseless, and a number of them got arrested. And when Greb went to the police station to press charges, one of Guy's little girls were there with Guy's wife, and she were crying, and mother were holding her. And Harry Greb said, "Who's that? Who are you here for?" And they said, "Oh, my husband's been arrested for carjacking," whatever they called it back in that time. And Harry Greb looked at little girl, and he said, famously said to police officers, he goes, "You know what? I'm not pressing charges. I gave him a good whipping anyway."
Yeah. I remember that one.
So they're both characters. They're both characters in different ways.
Yeah, and amazing. I think with Langford, especially, like, you know, grew up in it's a tough household. His dad was a rough and tumble guy, but Langford idolized Ruby Rob Fitzsimmons, who was hard as nails, and so was his wife. They were a power couple. You know, you could probably catch a left hook from either one of those two. Maybe he even got the solar plexus punch from her. That's what she'd hit him with when he got sassy. "Robert, you better," you know. But anyway, but Sam was idolizing a guy, and it's interesting. Like, so I didn't know this until maybe a year ago. I saw in the archive. So apparently Sam called out anyone in the world except for Jeffries, barring Jeffries, because he didn't think anyone could beat Jeffries, because he had beaten Fitz. that's I'm inferring that last part, but yeah. So like he basically wanted to fight anyone, but he wasn't one of the people calling for Jeffries to come out of retirement. He didn't think anyone could beat him. He was wrong about that. Jeffries, what do you say? He lost like 100 pounds for the Jack Johnson fight, but he'd been out so many seasons. I mean, he wasn't the same. See photos
He
before and
also
after. He looks like his own
he,
granddad.
he also had those years off and lost that weight and went into ring with one of the greatest heavyweight ring generals of all time. Not a
Yeah,
good move.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. He went in with
Johnson was a fantastically skilled fighter.
hugely
So
experienced and also a genius at spoiling
yeah,
people's boxing. But he was big. He could hit hard on the inside, as well as like bat stuff away. He was so good and so
I,
spatially aware. Yeah,
I always say when you watch Jack Johnson, has anybody ever seen him backed into a corner? I've never seen it. He knew that ring, used his feet. He knew. I've never seen Johnson pushed into a corner, forced into a corner. I've never seen him cut off in a corner. I may have missed it, but he circled the ring very well. He knew how to use his feet. And, even for Langford to fight him as a sub-21-year-old with a massive weight disadvantage, Johnson at this time were unbeaten coloured heavyweight champion at world. He got from Denver Ed Martin, and were beating McVeigh's and beating Jeanette's and all kinds of people. So really, it's incredible that Langford did even fight him. Again, that will to win, that desire to take whatever fights. Because again, like Greb, Langford had to eat. And if he didn't fight, he didn't eat. That's another thing about both of the careers. They weren't insanely paid early on. If they wanted to eat, they had to fight. And that hunger, that desire also, to me, blended into the characters. If they don't win, they don't eat. They have to win. They have to win. They have to win. But that builds like a resilience in them that they'll go down. They'll never go down without a massive fight.
absolutely. Adversity in combat sports and martial arts. It's overcoming adversity. Sometimes that adversity is size or numerical disadvantage or any manner of things. But these men, not only did they do incredible things, but then they both were fighting with one good eye, doing incredible things. It's terrifying to think of their drive.
Oh, random! You've just got a bit of feedback, buddy. Just started a second ago. You just got a bit of feedback.
Yeah, I was hearing my own echo. Okay, I think it stopped.
Yeah, it stopped now. Yeah.
Muted. That's cool. But yeah, so but these guys were able to made the absolute most. They got 101% out of what their potential was because they had the drive and the toughness. They both had a great chin. They both had good instincts, sense of distance. They both were extremely quick. And although they both had power, Langford used his power, his heavy artillery. He was the guy who was hard to get away from. Greb was the guy who's just hard to get a handle on. Greb will be like if you put a randomizer on Joe Calzaghe the night he fought Jeff Lacey with a bad wrist and put an absolute masterclass on him. But if you turned that up from 9.5 to 11, you might be approaching a Harry Greb. But he got the point for hitting him behind the back. That's a Harry Greb thing right there. He gave him a little punch behind the back. Greb would do stuff like he would uppercut you on the other side of he'd clinch you on his left arm on your left arm, then he would go underneath and uppercut you around both of your arms. He was, Langford wasn't formulaic, but he was more he was a ring cutting expert. You can see in the footage with Bill Lang too. Bill Lang much bigger than him, probably 30 pounds heavier, over 6 feet tall. Langford's a little short tank of a guy, but he's walking square. He's walking him down square, and he's doing parry counters from a square stance, just in the parts we saw. And the guy who filmed it, Hugh McIntosh, the promoter, he was Bill Lang's promoter. So probably that highlight isn't the worst parts of what happened to Bill Lang, but it was an absolute bloodbath. Mercy stoppage on a foul, but it was a bloodbath. People were being sprayed.
To me, I've spoken it before. Bill Lang was psyched out before the fight started because Bill Lang were coming. He were a rising contender. There were a lot of buzz around him. It were expected he could go far, maybe challenge for heavyweight title. And he's here fighting Sam Langford, and his manager says go down to his training camp and unsettle the kid. Let him see who he's up against. So he goes down to Langford's training camp, and Langford's sparring. And Langford actually saw him, stood near the ring. There were little buzz. People were going up to him in his entourage, and that when they were there. And And Langford saw him and he were getting gloved up in ring. And Langford looked at him and smiled and then got gloved up at sparring. They came out and they walked out in Langford and sparring partner, and Langford threw this looping right hand, bang, fired a quick shot right at start, hit this poor kid straight in face, and this kid just collapsed in a heap. And article I were reading where they were interviewing Bill Lang's manager, and he was saying, "Oh my goodness, that quite didn't turn out as planned." Because apparently Bill Lang looked up at Langford when he'd see kid get absolutely flattened, one punch. Looked up at Langford, and Langford smiled and winked at him. And apparently the story was that when they were going to ring the night at fight, Bill Lang was psyched. Langford had got him. He'd psychologically got him. And in that fight, even though Bill Lang has a large weight advantage and size advantage, he's on the retreat. He's just trying to stay out of Langford's way, obviously witnessing that power firsthand. But yeah, shows how psychology plays a part. And psychology played a part with Greb as well, because many opponents didn't want to fight Harry Greb because, when you're going in with Willie Meehan, who always gave Dempsey very difficult fights due to his awkward style that kind of conflicted against Dempsey's style. And when you're going in with fighters like Bill Brennan, who could give Dempsey good fights, and you're whipping them really easy, when you're a middleweight and you're whipping fighters who brutal Jack Dempsey is having trouble beating, and you're whipping him easy, that also had a psychological impact on many fighters. And that's why someone like Johnny Wilson, he wasn't banned from the sport, but many states wouldn't have him fighting there. His fight levels in a few years before he fought Greb dropped noticeably because a lot of people wouldn't entertain him. I've read all articles, they're calling him a yellow belly, a coward. I mean, everyone in the world knew pretty much that as soon as Greb got a shot at that middleweight title, he were going to take that title, even though he'd had over 200 fights and he were past his prime, as many people thought. He wasn't quite the Greb of, the earlier years. They still knew that he were way too good for Johnny Wilson. So, they're both kind of, and also they both fought blind for a portion of the career. Greb went blind in one eye, damaged in Anderson fight, and then more so in Norfolk fight after that, which, increased the damage. Langford, of course. Fred Fulton famously kept hitting him with those ramrod left hands, and even Sam Langford himself said in interviews later that Fred Fulton damaged me eye were never the same after that fight. So they both also showed that incredible resilience in fighting with limited eyesight. Langford, of course, against Brad Simmons, was legally blind in his last fight. He was taken out in one round. He actually had to be out through the ring ropes because he actually couldn't see anything, but he was still willing to get in the ring and try and fight the guy, thinking, if I get close and I land a good shot, I might be able to get a win over him, if I can knock him out. But yeah, both guys also fought with that incredible handicap as well.
He got Tiger Flowers like that in, what was that, 22?
Oh yeah, Tiger Flowers. He said, "How's it going, Sam?" He'd been hit by like 100 left and rights from Flowers, who had very quick hands, southpaw, and he went and sat on stool and said, "How's it going out there, Sam?" He said, "Oh, kid's making mistakes. If he makes them in next round, it's an early night." And of course, Flowers left a gap, and Langford bang, second round, Flowers out. So yeah, limited due to eyesight damage, but still extremely dangerous.
Yeah, that was Sam Langford. Oh, hold on, we're not. I'm getting an echo again. Check. Oh, there we go.
Scrap. Oh, feedback. Yeah, I'm getting feedback now.
Scrap, do you have us on speaker?
No, I do not.
Oh. Scrapbook, I wanted to ask you. Yeah, there's still feedback. I don't know who from. What do you think about the? How do you think we can quantify their overall opposition? Because they both fought so many great fighters. Greb fought more Hall of Famers, but Langford had more fights against them. They both fought a lot of champions. Langford fought more fighters at higher weights than Greb. Greb, to me, may have fought a greater diversity in a way. In terms of overall numbers of quality fighters, Langford fought an insane number, but Greb did as well. But then, to me, Sam Langford had tougher fight runs. Even Greb's fight runs were Loughran, Jeff Smith, Tunney. They weren't the fight numbers of the McVeigh, Jeanette, Will series, for example. How how do you think we can quantify who fought the better opposition? What do you think we need to look at?
Well, when you look at 1917, and when you take a look at Harry Greb at the moment of his years in 1917, he was in the ring with Fake Kaiser, Jeff Smith. He was in the ring with Mike Gibbons, Zulu Kid. I mean, the top names, Soldier Barfield, he really handled those fighters as though he belonged there. When you look at Sam Langford walked into any ring and dominated, whether he won or lost. And so when you look at both of these fighters and you try and put them all in one bowl of soup, if you will, I think Sam Langford, let's say, for instance, the Harry Wills. He was in there 22 times. Some say 18 times. Some say 23 times. And when he faced Harry Wills was at the top of his game while he was fighting Sam Langford. When you look at Harry Greb, I'm trying to see the top of his game, those opponents who are top-rated opponents, where he actually was mentally during that time. So as Sam Langford, we know that Sam Langford was in the ring with fighters such as Harry Wills and Joe Jeanette and Jack Johnson and Sam McVeigh. I mean, he fought the Dave Hollies of the world. He fought the Joe Gans and the Joe Walcotts. Everybody you can think of he was in the ring with. Harry Greb fought everybody that would face him. So it's hard to really put into words. And that's why when I started my opening statement, it's very difficult because Sam Langford never got that chance to prove how he would have fared under those circumstances. He proved it in the divisions of his class, if you will, but he never really got a full shot. 1911, he was in the ring with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. Now, the first time he faced him, the referee, and I love Charlie White. I think he's a fantastic referee, but he's prevented Sam Langford from getting a knockout. Now, the next time he faced him, he did knock him out. So it depends on the opportunities that Sam Langford would have received to make a full assessment. Based on what he has done, I think Sam Langford did a little better in the opposition that he was in the ring with than Harry Greb. Now, how do I say that when Harry Greb defeated Gene Tunney in 1922, which is one of the greatest years in all of boxing? But then he fought Gene Tunney a few more times. As to Sam Langford dominated a lot of the fighters he was in the ring with. Now, did he beat Harry Wills the majority of their fights? No, he did not. Did he defeat Jack Johnson? No, he did not. But he was in the ring with them, and he put up world-class championship caliber performances. So it's very difficult to really break it down as to who had a better career, if you will. But I would say both of them did their thing, but I would say Sam Langford, based on what he was allowed to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. Again, because it really goes back to that. If Langford had names on there like Hart, Burns, Willard, he called out Willard out, even though he were past his prime. I'm getting feedback again.
I keep getting cut off. I don't know why. I keep getting cut off. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, it's still there. I'll drop off and come back on.
I'll do the same thing. I'll come right back.
Oh, hello there.
Oh, welcome back. I was just saying it's hard to narrow down Langford's prime because here's Scrap now. Hold on.
Yeah,
Okay, there we go.
I've cancelled my StreamYard today. I was having constant problems with it. It was getting ridiculous,
Yeah,
you
I
know.
like
And
the image files, but it can be a little taxing at times. But Langford, like he had multiple. He was dangerous he was a top shelf lightweight. He was a top shelf welterweight the very next year. The year after that, in 1905, now he's like fighting at middleweight, and he's young Peter Jackson. Oh my goodness! And then he's fighting
one,
heavyweight.
one,
He's fighting Joe Jeanette.
one,
It's
one thing
incredible.
about the careers, though, as well, not even Langford can match Harry Greb's 1919 feat. In
Oh
fact, I think
no.
100% agree.
Harry Greb's running near, well, over 100 fights in 3 years is an insane fight total. I mean, if people think about that, to have over 100 fights in just 3 years, when you're fighting many Hall of Fame fighters, from Mike Gibbons a few times, Leo Hook, Levinsky a whole number of times, he was reigning light heavyweight champion, Jeff Smith wiping Jack Dillon a few times. The sheer insane amount of opposition he fought in that 3 years, having over 100 fights in 3 years, is incredible. I mean, he went on a win run, a run, like I said, of over 120 fights with one established defeat. I mean, that is incredible when you consider opposition. And also in that time, when he lost to Gibbons in the first fight, when he fought him again, Gibbons were on an unbeaten run since beating Greb. Mike Gibbons had never lost from when he beat Greb. He'd had more fights and never lost. So when Harry Greb fought him in rematch, he was not only fighting a guy who beaten him, but fighting a guy who beaten him who hadn't lost since. He'd not lost a fight. But Greb avenged that. The multiple wins over Levinsky and Jeff Smith, fighters like that, are incredible. He also later avenged other defeats he had to Tommy Gibbons. Tommy Gibbons beat him earlier in his career. He then avenged that later. So they both fought incredible fight runs against many great fighters. And for the most part, both of them, won most of their fight series. Like Scrapbook alluded to, Langford didn't win the fight series with Wills, but the problem there is, like Scrap mentioned, Wills were coming into his own. He were having fights with Langford and super tough, hard fighters to beat on the day, like Sam McVeigh. Sam McVeigh were a major fighter. Even Jack Johnson said, if you're fighting Sam McVeigh, you've got to train for 20 hard rounds, because no fight with him is easy. So Wills had built a lot of experience. And, from those early fights with Langford, where Langford won a few, it were actually 2 wins Langford, 2 wins Wills, 1 draw in the first 5 fights. But after that, Langford started leaving his prime. He was getting just a little bit older. He was packing a little bit more weight on than what he used to. And Wills was starting to come into his rhythm, into destructive punching machine he became. So, Scrapbook's very right that Wills was reaching peak of his powers from 1917 to 1922, more 1921. But in that time, I'm not surprised Wills, beat Langford a whole number of times. Langford were past his prime, Wills were coming into his prime. And he'd also built up that great experience fighting Langford, McVeigh, Jeanette, and others. So it is very hard to separate their opposition, because they both fought an enormous pile of top quality fighters. Like Scrapbook says, Langford were denied fighting many at fights he wanted to fight against the more established champions. To me, I've always thought that the coloured champions were often way better than the champions for the established titles anyway. When Jack Johnson was coloured heavyweight champion in 1906, to me, he was better than Hart. He was better than Burns, who would replace him. He was better than most heavyweights around. And same when we go into early 1910s, the major heavyweight contenders were McVeigh, Jeanette, and Langford. Below Johnson as champion. The white fighters at that time were not really that good. That some of them were tough and dependable. We had Jim Flynn's, Kubiak's, Tony Ross's, all of these guys, but they were not the superstars. Actually, I once debated with someone. I said, because he said, "Oh, Langford didn't fight the best heavyweights." I said, "No, he did." "Oh, no, he was behind colour line." I said, "Well, tough. The best heavyweights in that time were the black heavyweights. They were the best heavyweights of their time." When you look at that quartet and then Wills joining as a 5th member later, those 5 heavyweights were the best heavyweights in the world from 1906 you know, to 1919 without a shadow of a doubt. Langford fought them all, and fought them all pretty much 50 times virtually, which is an incredible run considering they're all Hall of Fame heavyweights, every one of them. Johnson, Wills, Jeanette McVeigh, all of Hall of Fame heavyweights, and Langford had virtually 50 fights against them. You know, in a 13-year period, 14-year period, which is just incredible considering all other fights he had as well. In Greb's side, though, he's no slouch. You know, he had the 6 wins against Levinsky, the 2 against Dillon. He won and lost to Mike Gibbons. You know, he had the fight series with Tommy Gibbons. He had the big fight series with Tommy Loughran, who won at great master boxers of his time, moving, punching, counter punching, very technical fighter, gave Tony a whole headache, you know, in their fight, fighting Mickey Walker, the toy bulldog, fighting the great Tiger Flowers, you know, fighting Kid Norfolk on 2 occasions. So in a way, fighting other fighters as well, tough, dependable contenders like, you know, Langford and those guys fought. He also fought the Meehan's and he fought the Brennans. He also fought other great fighters like Billy Miska a number of times. So they both had incredible fight runs. I just think Langford's fight runs are longer. And also, he's fighting opponents as a smaller fighter who came up all those years ago. So to me, having virtually 50 fights against Hall of Fame heavyweights and the best fighters of his generation at heavyweight, minusing those who wouldn't get in a ring with him, you know, to me, Greb's great runs against those other fighters cannot quite match that. I think Langford takes it in that regard.
Yeah, and great point. I just want to jump in and say, when you look at Harry Greb, he was in the ring with Jeff Smith, the Bayonne Globetrotter, 7 times. He was in the ring with Faye Kaiser 9 times. He was in the ring with a lot of fighters multiple times. When you look at Sam Langford, here's a man who came from featherweight, moved up to the lightweight division, and knocked out over 100 heavyweights. So when you look at a person like him, and you look at the men he was in the ring with in his era, I always mention when I look at fighters, when I grade fighters, how do you do when you move into an era, you excel in that era, and then you move out of the era and continue to compete? Sam Langford is the epitome of that because he's in there with all weight divisions. He captures multiple titles along the way, and he's knocking men out consistently. And when we look at the fight film that Random had put up before with Bill Lang, you can see Sam Langford walking down the heavyweight. He's walking down this heavyweight straight forward. He's jabbing, slipping, bobbing, weaving. He's cutting off the ring. All these things in the years that he fought, in the weight divisions that he moved up from to. So when you look at a man like that, you really have to take your hat off to him as he's sitting down on his film. I mean, incredible fighter was Sam Langford. Astonishing fighter was Harry Greb. That's why I have him 1 and 2. And I just think that these 2 men is a good benchmark for what it takes to be. Now, this is Bill Lang right here. And look at Sam Langford. Catching shots, bobbing and weaving.
Yeah, look at that.
Slowed it down so you can see the skills. Look at that. Beautiful
Totally
carry.
deflected it. Saw it coming, didn't he?
Amazing. He does not take a step back.
But Langford there knew that shot didn't have much on it. It just allowed him to glance it because he knew it wasn't out major.
Right. Jabs to the pit of the stomach. Very important move. And
bobbing down to right as he did it to avoid counter. Very clever.
Yeah, and he knows Lang respects his power, so he keeps showing him the right hand and then throwing that left hook, that vicious left hook of his that he got from Georgie Byers.
And there's a such thing called throwaway punches. When you throw away a punch, just to see what the man would do if you would have landed, and then you set him up for the next one. And I see Sam Langford doing that as well. Feinting, moving his hands in certain positions. See what Bill Lang would do if I threw a right hand, how he would move his head, and now how to set it up the next time. Very impressive fighter was Sam Langford. He really was.
And yeah, Bill Lang had 30 pounds on him, I believe. Scrap, that's about right. He had about 30 pounds on him that night.
Yes, about 13, 14 pounds.
Hey, and I've been meaning to ask you guys, is there any suggestion that Hugh McIntosh also promoted Langford and McVeigh's fight in Paris this same year in 1911 in April? The reason I ask is because in Australia, they were using the footage of this and the footage of the McVeigh Langford, the 20-round draw in 4-ounce gloves, no less, in Paris in April when they were promoting in Australia. I saw it in the newspapers. They were going to do talks over the highlights. So I'm wondering if McIntosh actually promoted that fight in Paris. But have you guys heard anything along those lines?
No, I haven't actually. No, I'm aware of 20-round draw. I've read many articles on that fight. That was a tough fight, but no, I haven't quite heard that. No.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I'm just going through my little footage here.
Well, I do know that Sam Langford has signed with a Denver-based promoter. His name was Jimmy Hamel for the fight with Kid Norfolk on December 17th. That was at the Denver Stadium in Stockyard. I'm not sure how long he was with that promotion, but I'm not sure about Hugh McIntosh. I mean, he was a very good promoter as well, but I'm not sure about that particular bout that you're referring to.
Yeah, I was only guessing that because they were promoting with that footage. So I was like, well, I don't think the fighter set it up. I would think it would be Hugh himself because that event, that Lang event in London was a big deal fight. That was supposed to be Lang's coming out party. It turned out he got slaughtered, but there he is on the ground. Langford's just chilling with the ref. There's Langford doing like the push-off exercise. I think that's Bob Armstrong. Maybe he's pushing in that first little bit. Then Georgie Byers jumps in. Langford just had abnormally long arms, but he would do drills like this.
Yeah,
Post off the guy.
building up
Walter
his
Payton
strength in his
stiff arm
shoulders.
going on.
Old trick for maintaining range, gaining distance to punch,
Yes.
And also keeping your opponent off balance. So old school tricks. You see, the thing is with Jack Blackburn, who trained Joe Louis, he knew of these tricks. When he took over Lewis and he said he was ungainly, very powerful, but ungainly. First thing he said is footwork and balance.
Yes.
He said if I can get his footwork right, his balance right, he said this kid's going to do a lot of damage. So, but those were old world tricks learned from Blackburn's time, from great fighters from Blackburn's time and from his own experience. You know, closing range with a shuffling of the feet forwards, close range. You know, all these things were just the old school techniques that Blackburn taught Lewis. People credit Joe Louis saying, "Oh, he's a modern fighter." No, he was a modern fighter, but he was trained in the old school techniques by a master boxer himself. You know, in Jack Blackburn.
Right. Yeah, he's a throwback.
Yeah.
Look at this right here. Look at Langford with the parry counter. You see Joe Louis do a version of that, although he isn't set as low. He had to sort of lean over. Langford was already set low.
And the timing of that shot as well, bang on target, perfectly timed as well. That's Langford's experience right there.
Look, he goes to the body, throws the uppercut, crowds him, and then hits a parry counter left hook, and then Lang's trying to do his little Jack O'Brien.
And when you see Langford hitting him to the body, you can see Bill Lang's arching forward. You can see those body punches are hurting.
Yeah,
look at him there, bending.
Incredible.
Bending with that body shot.
Oh, beautiful shot. And he comes up with an attempt at uppercut. Oh, Mike Tyson move.
That's poetry in motion. You can see just in the little bit of footage from the 3 fights we do have, and he fights them differently because Jeanette and him, that was their 10th fight. They knew each other inside and out. So that was a different kind of fight. Jeanette with those wonderful lunging jabs, high and low. But then when he fought Jim Flynn, he's fighting somewhat on the retreat, but he's posting off like we saw in that drill, and then he's launching these deadly uppercuts as he goes backwards. Langford, when he had his mobility, that was in 1910, that fight, their second fight of the year. And when he had his full mobility, he was terrifying. And because he had a unique build, who you going to get to spar with, just like with Harry Greb, who you going to spar with to get you ready for Sam Langford if you can't get Langford himself? There's no one like him. Some guys are like that. I bring up Joe Calzaghe a lot because I always love watching. I like the way he fights. You know, he'd get knocked down or hurt, and he would just come in with the fury so he could box or brawl. But he was, you know, it was pressure and just but using, you know, Calzaghe had speed. He had that fast twitch thing, and his dad being a musician gave him sort of an improvisational sense of timing. Greb was probably like a little bit a lot wilder version of that, just even more creative, especially in the rule set that he was under. He could do a little more, smaller gloves as well. And he
The
didn't
thing
have
about Harry Greb's style, he is very different. Langford were an experienced boxer. Greb was an experienced brawler. And basically how Greb took it is when that first round goes, he'd literally rush at you and start battering you senseless with both hands. And straight away, it's like they used to say, you can't figure Greb out because he don't give you time. One guy said the first bell went and he descended on his opponent like a swarm of bees, and just shot across the ring, literally running at this guy and started unloading just furious salvos of two-handed punches. And this poor guy were getting literally buffeted all around ring. And he could do nothing. He literally had to keep his defense up to avoid getting battered and knocked out. And he just couldn't retaliate because when you're under fire like that, constant aggression and someone's powering punches at you, you have to cover up or you're going to be made a mess. And he fought very different to Langford in that he just didn't give his opponents, people have said to me, oh, well, Robinson would time and counter Greb. I'm like, no, he wouldn't have time to do that. Greb's not going to stand there and jab, letting Robinson parry and then start timing Greb's right hands and timing his jab and looking at his footwork. Greb ain't going to give him a chance to do that. So Greb fought opponents and just were like a swarm of angry bees, bzzz, stinging everywhere all at once. So his style were very effective. He wasn't as skilled a boxer as Langford. Langford, to me, had better footwork than Greb in a classical sense. To me, he had a better jab and threw better trademark punches than Harry Greb. Harry Greb would often jump up in air and punch downwards and try and punch him on top of head, or he'd hit him with backhands, like Mickey Walker said. Greb missed a shot and spun round, so Walker thought, oh, I've got a second, lowered his hands, and then suddenly Greb saw the gloves in his mouth, and he's like, how the hell did he hit me when he's facing backwards? So very, very different style, but again, Greb's style was very effective. And fighting the big men with that bouncing, darting speed, I mean, like in the spars with Dempsey, where everybody were, some at spars got 3,000 or 4,000 people coming to watch him after first view, because Greb were putting on such a display against Dempsey, and Dempsey were like a lumbering Hulk trying to catch him. He just couldn't catch him. So Greb's style was very different to Langford's, but also very effective.
Yeah, there's certain men, I just want to say, guys, there's certain men that you don't walk in on. You don't walk in on Jack Johnson. You don't walk in on Joe Jeanette. You don't walk in on Sam McVeigh. And Sam Langford did that. He did that. Whether he got knocked down, he would get back up and walk right to him again. And here's a man who's 5'7", 5'6.5" or whatever. Yeah. Here's a man who walked right in on you and said, let's have at it. I mean, it's just amazing. And Harry Greb, with his own style, same attitude.
Scrap, that is a really good point. And it's something also worth noting. When Greb fought the bigger opponents, like many people said, he beat them with blazing speed. Okay, speed in and out. They couldn't catch him. They couldn't tag him. He didn't seem to have any tight defense, but you couldn't catch him clean. He was moving, like Tony said, he's never in the same spot for half a second. He goes left, he goes right. He comes in, he's clubbing you on back of head. He's elbowing you in face. Then suddenly he's moving. You can't pin him. Your swinging punches are all missing. But it's a very good point you make that Langford, like in some of the McVeigh fights, he would actually, even though he was shorter and lighter, and not as physically powerful a specimen as McVeigh. McVeigh were very tough and durable as well, very strong. Could maintain his punch power for 20, 30 rounds, 40 rounds, no problem. Langford could bully him backwards. I mean, that is crazy that, like you said, he would sometimes turn into Hunter. And these big, powerful heavyweights would literally be backing off him, trying to stay out of his way. Whereas Harry Greb would outspeed them, just outwork them. Langford would think, well, no, I'll hunt you down and I'll knock you out. I'll finish you.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very good point, that Scrap.
That's a first-rate point. Greb was always moving the area of engagement, whereas Langford was closing his distance like a battleship. And, like you said, that first fight in Paris, that's the last time I found that that he was around the middleweight limit, close to it. Not of the day, but like close to what we think of as middleweight. He was like, I think about 161. McVeigh was just over 200 pounds. That was crunchy for McVeigh because he fought heavier than that later on, but he gave up 40 pounds in 4-ounce gloves, like MMA gloves. weight gloves, 4-ounce gloves, and made McVeigh fight on the retreat. And this was McVeigh who would, he like Langford, like he got Bill Lang out of there way easier than Langford. McVeigh was a tremendous puncher, but he knew to beat Langford, he had to fight on the retreat. He had to fight with straight lefts and that hook, that wonderful hook of his on the retreat, because like you guys say, don't close the gap on Langford. What you do is you keep him on the end of your jab, and hope that he's gotten old. You're fighting him in a season when he's gotten a little bit older, he's a little bit heavy, like the Gunboat Smith fight in, I think that was 1913 or 14, the first Gunboat Smith meeting.
1913, I think. He lost on points, didn't
he? Yeah, and it was a bit of a surprise decision. Not everyone who was there thought that he should have gotten the thing, but he was using that jab. Like later on in 17, Fred Fulton mashed his eye up with that long jab, so like there was a way to game plan Langford, especially as he slowed down. But when he was at his best, he was very nimble, so he could close the gap. And that Bill Lang fight, I love watching that on slow motion. I zoom it in, I edit videos just to watch, because if you see the way his foot position relative to Lang's at all times, he's always in complete command of the angles down to the single degree. It's just absolutely brilliant. Lang sidesteps and Langford just shuffles in like the bishop on a chessboard. He's just coming in diagonal. He just gives him no space. But when Lang plants and tries to get some work in and like bully him with his size, he just gets outgunned and he has to go get on his bike. They had very different approaches, these two men, but they were absolute ferocious competitors. So they, in their own ways, Langford later in his career, he got beat down by all the being shut out, especially, once Willard beat Johnson, and that was it. The line went up hard and fast, and so it was unfortunate. So later in his career, Langford didn't train as hard and stuff like that. He'd always kind of smoked in and around fights and drank. He didn't abstain. I would just put it that way.
Did it for the money, yeah. What's amazing, Random and Bill, is that Sam Langford started his career 10 years before Harry Greb. But they both finished the same year in 26. And what was incredible to me is that Sam Langford, up until the point where, in 1922, when he faced Tiger Flowers, who was a young man who really wanted this, Sam Langford was like 37 years old. It's really amazing when you look at the career of these men, and you just take a look and see what these men had to offer. It's really, really amazing. It really, really amazing.
I actually think as well, another point is how effective Langford still was after he left his prime. Yeah, he couldn't beat Harry Wills when he left his prime. His wins over Wills were earlier, 1914, 1915, etc. But 1916. But even when you look at Langford later on, he's still fighting really tough opposition. He's still fighting Jeff Clarks. He later fights, Norfolk, Tiger Flowers, blows him out. He fights the massive George Godfrey, the Leaperville Shadow. Tunney didn't want to go near, like Roadrunner. He fought these guys. And some Scrapbook mentioned earlier, Langford, Greb did to an extent, but I don't think to Langford's extent. Langford fought, to me, probably 3 of the top 5 greatest fighters, maybe, dare I say, of 1900, 1910, Walcott, Johnson, and Gans.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
He fought those guys. And then when you go into 1910s, there's through the rest of that decade into 1910s and beyond, there's Jeanette McVeigh, there's all these other guys around. Then the next generation, Wills comes in mid-1910s. Then we've got Flowers, Norfolk, Fred Fulton, Meehan. We've got all these other guys, Jeff Clark. They all start coming in, and then he fights all them. So he fights like 3 generations across 3 generations of fighters, which is superior to what Greb did. Greb, yes, he did pretty much the same fights in half the number of years, but he fought pretty much across 2 generations. The 1910s middleweights and light heavyweights like, Levinsky, Dillon, McCoy and Chip and Mike Gibbons and Tommy Gibbons and Misk. He fought all those. Then into 20s, he went on to the Loughran's. The Jeff Smith crossed over both, but the Loughran's, the Rosenblums, the Mickey Walkers, the Norfolks. Woo! So to me, Langford was more successful over more kind of eras of fighters, if you get me, if I'm saying that right.
No, yeah, I totally understand. And look at both of these men. They come from a lineage. We showed Bob Fitzsimmons. You know how strong Bob Fitzsimmons was that era? Those men would give you a handshake and always break your hands. That was an old school era. There was no electric tools or anything. Everything was cutting the tree down with an axe. And this is the era that these men came from. So it's really incredible.
Sorry, Scrapbook, you went silent there, mate.
Oh no, we lost Scrap. Okay, he'll resume when he comes back. But
Also, I'll just say as well.
I think yeah, go ahead.
I have to be brutally honest here, because if there were advantages Greb, I'd be giving him. I have gave a few advantages to Greb, but another advantage is the size difference. In both of these guys moved weights, and I've said I give the weight move to Langford. It has to go to Langford. Also, fighting men of giving away size and reach advantage and weight advantage, I also have to give to Sam Langford, because even when he were past his prime, he were fighting Wills 6'3.5", over 200 pounds. He were fighting Big Bill Tate, who was 6'6", one of Dempsey's chief sparring partners he used for Willard and other fights. He were fighting Fred Fulton, 6'6", gigantic puncher, massive knockout record. So even though, you know, Harry Greb did fight many fighters with significant height, reach, and weight disadvantages, to me, Langford edges that as well. He fought way bigger opponents for the most part than Harry Greb did. Even many of the heavyweight contenders Greb fought, like Bill Brennan, you know, Quinton Rojas and Reno and Roper and a number of others, they were not the giants like Fulton, Tate, Harry Wills, etc. So I have to give that edge to Langford as well. And like when he used to fight Battling Jim, you know, he could come in up to 240 pounds. He was 6'3", 6'4" tall, a huge guy, durable, strong, a proper full-blown heavyweight, like a 240-pound Derek Chisora, but a very durable Derek Chisora. So, you know, when you fought him, you had a hard fight, and Langford had fight these big men, much smaller than Greb, but he fought across more weights, and therefore, coming from those low weights, he fought heavyweights who just daunted him. You know, I've seen pictures of Langford stood poking a jab out at Bill Tate's chin, and I mean, the size difference is scandalous. So, advantage in who fought opponents of bigger size, I have to edge.
Is the right word.
I have to edge to Sam Langford as well.
Yeah, and he pushed the limits. I'm trying to think. I think somewhere in here, I can't remember if I removed it to make space. No, here it is. Here's a picture of him in 1920, his comeback season. I redid it with the you know, color coded for wins, losses, and draws, no contest. But there he is right there. Look at that little dude. That's him in 1920 at a training camp. He's a little ball of muscle. So even when he got heavier and he was coming in over 180, over 190, even at 200 times, he could carry. That's what he said at the time. He said, yeah, I got a little extra around me, but I can carry it. I got a big frame.
Yeah, sure, look at those shoulders. Look at those shoulders. He looks like a bodybuilder. He's 5'6.5". You know, a lot of his power came not only from his leverage and his positioning, his placement, but also his shoulders. Very powerful shoulders and chest. So yeah, he were a major proposition. Even past his prime, he could just knock you out cold one shot. I mean, he knocked George Godfrey out in 2 rounds. I mean, this is a guy who's 6'4", you know, who many fighters weren't keen on tackling George Godfrey, and Langford fought him a number of times. One of them wiped him out in 2 rounds. I mean, he's knocking out a big heavyweight who'd go on to be a coloured heavyweight champion, who'd go on to have dozens and dozens of knockouts in his own career. And Langford were capable of knocking these people out. Now, Greb wasn't a knockout puncher. Like I said, if you ask Book Krause will say, no, Greb could punch really hard. Because I think Greb said, well, let's give him a 100 count. He still won't be up. He famously apparently said that in ring after he'd wiped him out. He said, oh, let's give him a 100 count and he still won't be up. Joking about it. Guy were laid out cold. But, you know, I definitely have to give the fighting bigger guys to Langford.
Yeah, and I think Greb's advantage in if we look at it through that prism, at least his advantage is that he crammed so much into a shorter span. Like he averaged something like a fight every 16.5 days, somewhere in that range, 17 days in the years he competed, and then he died young. Like he
Yeah,
literally fought
Langford's is
himself to
nearly
death.
double that. Langford's is nearly double that. So yeah, Greb's activity is crazy. But you see, the thing is, when you look at these two, I can't give the weight move to him. I can't give the giving away advantages to him. That goes to Langford. I can't give away the power. That goes to Langford. The activity I can give to Greb. The opponents both fought a massive list of great opponents. But I think, like I pointed out, Greb fought a lot of his great opponents at middleweight and light heavyweight, coming from 140 light middleweight. Langford fought most of his great opponents at the very top after coming from a much lower weight. So I think in overall opponents, and also some at fight runs, 14 fights and 15 fights with McVeigh and Jeanette, all from 17 to 22 fights, depending on what source you use, against Harry Wills. I mean, these are insane fight runs. And someone once said to me that, well, we can't really, one idiot on YouTube said, we can't really credit Langford because he fought McVeigh so many times. I'm like, do you think it were easy to fight Sam McVeigh that many times? Do you think after you've fought him 3 times, it's going to get any easier to fight him a 4th time? What they were trying to do is
see in that
diminish.
10th fight of Jeanette, they know each other so well. They're still landing, but they're like when you give a
Exactly.
clever fighter like McVeigh a really good look at you, like the first, so by the time they'd had 2 fights, they've seen 40 rounds of each other. So by the time they were coming into 1912 for that 4-fight 1912 season, they'd already
he
fought
actually
40
said
rounds.
he said that any wins that Langford has against Jeanette and McVeigh after 3 fights are discredited because he shouldn't be fighting them that much. And I'm like, well, this is a guy who also said that Marciano beat a prime Joe Louis and that Lennox Lewis beat a prime Mike Tyson. So,
Oh, I see. So they're just someone who they just don't understand. I mean, the thing is, like, it's pretty rare for people to fight top legends to fight each other in their primes. That's why it gets so celebrated. But sometimes you get great performances by someone who's past their best, but they're still the best, or they're still among the best. And Langford was like that, but he got shut out heavily, even more heavily later in his career, even though he was very busy.
I mean,
but Greb, man, Walker,
it's a
late career win. Beats the
it's
great
a
Mickey
ridiculous
Walker.
criticism because when you look at a more modern example from these 2 guys, Ali and Frazier, I'm sorry, because they'd fought twice, the 3rd fight wasn't easier. The 3rd fight were more brutal because, like you pointed out, they knew each other. So, when Greb's fighting Loughran a number of times and Jeff Smith a number of times, in one of them fights, Jeff Smith pieced Greb's face up. Greb actually said after the fight, look at me, I ain't got a mark on him. Look at my face, he's battered me. Because Greb was just very jovial. If someone battered him, he just said they battered me, but I'll batter him next week. Greb won the fight, but he took a hell of a lot of facial damage because Jeff Smith was so used to him and he was a great fighter himself. He was timing him, he was picking him off. He kind of knew what to expect in a way. So he was waiting while Greb came in, and then he was firing multi-punch combinations as Greb came in, just on off chance he could catch him. And he couldn't catch him and knock him out, but he was catching him and causing him facial damage. Greb won the fight, but he had way more facial damage than Jeff Smith. Greb actually said Jeff Smith was probably one of the most difficult opponents he ever fought. Gene Tunney also said that, interestingly, about Jeff Smith, showing how great a fighter he was. But
hugely underrated. And I gotta thank you guys for speaking about the guy, because I didn't know who he was, but you'd always like Jeff Smith, aka Jerome Jeffords. Certain guys you always talk up as being very underrated. Leo Hook, especially Langford and Greb. But I mean, they're appreciated by the old school heads. But even those of us that appreciate them, it's still hard to wrap your head around everything they did. They had multiple careers in one.
Leo Hook were a bit like a Langford in some ways, except he came from flyweight, and he actually fought gunboat. He fought a heavyweight, so he fought across weights from flyweight to heavyweight. But when he were fighting middleweight, welterweight, middleweight, and light heavyweight Hall of Famers and champions, he'd actually go in the pocket and fight with them. Leo Hook, he wouldn't back off and try and escape and try and be clever and cute and he'd often walk into light heavyweight Hall of Famers and have a fight with them, toe to toe. He'd fight them on inside, even though they're bigger than him, longer than him. He had no fear. And Langford and Greb were saying they had no fear. But a number of fighters back in that, of course, Greb beat Hook 3 times in 1919. But using that blazing speed and crazy work rate, Leo Hook couldn't deal with it. like many of Greb's opponents couldn't. You know, even Mickey Walker, I mean, after in what they say were last great middleweight title battle of Greb's career, because many people thought the last fight with Tiger Flowers that Greb lost, when Greb said, well, you know, if there was any fight I ever won, that was it. He wasn't happy he'd not got the verdict, and many other people thought he should have got verdict, but Flowers got it. But, you know, against Mickey Walker, you know, for the first 4 or 5 rounds, he was switching on and off, you know, letting Walker have ascendancy, taking those breaks. And then when he went into crazy mode, he just started dominating the fight. And by round 10, Greb was in charge that fight. You know, Mickey Walker couldn't maintain that pace with him. But yeah, just incredible fighters, really. Even at the late stage, whereas Langford could knock out even big heavyweights, big young heavyweights, past his prime, and other rising contenders like Norfolk and Flowers, and knock out big heavyweights like Godfrey. Greb could also use all that experience and savvy and his tools to still beat great fighters of the future like Walker, Rosenblum, Tommy Loughran, you know, in his era as well, past his prime. Because when he fought Wilson in 1923, he were already past his prime. He'd had over 220 fights. He were already past his prime before he even got a world title shot. Now, there is a bit of contention there, because actually one of the fights with Levinsky and a fight with a fighter called Al McCoy, who was a brief lineal middleweight champion in decade of 1910s. Those fights were actually for the light heavyweight and middleweight titles. And in this particular Levinsky fight, Greb had him reeling in the last 2 rounds and unleashed the kitchen sink. But Levinsky managed to survive. If Greb would have scored a knockout, he'd have been the light heavyweight champion of the world.
And you know what's impressive, BL? What you're saying right now is that Harry Greb, when he took on Gene Tunney in 22, he won the America's Light Heavyweight Championship title. Then he came down in 23 and he faced Johnny Wilson and won the Middleweight Championship title. What was impressive to me about that, it goes to show how Harry Greb was willing to take on the magnitude of fighters during the course of time that he faced them. And that's very impressive. When you look at Sam Langford faced Joe Gans in 1903. He fought Barbados Demon Joe Walcott in 1904. He would take on young Peter Jackson for the colored middleweight championship title in 1905. And in 1906, he moved up to the heavyweight division. He gave up, well, he weighed 164 pounds. And about 167, I would say. And Jack Johnson was over just about 200 pounds. He was about 20, going on 21 years old. And he just faced Joe Jeanette 2 weeks before that with a sprained hand in 1906. And he would take on Jack Johnson, one of the most fierce heavyweights during that era. So it was very impressive with both these men. But I think about Sam Langford. Once again, the men he was in the ring with, the Iron Man of West Hoboken, Joe Jeanette, facing him 2 weeks before Jack Johnson for the colored heavyweight championship title, is very, very impressive. And he just moved up.
If I can just break in, that photo on the right-hand side there is one I found in the newspaper. That's 1905 newspaper clipping previewing Jeanette's fight with Langford. Just wanted to throw that in there. That's the youngest picture of Jeanette I've actually seen myself.
This one we're looking at right now?
Yes, sir.
Wow, that's incredible, Random.
Yeah, that's nice. Where'd you get that?
I think that's the first fight. I found it in the newspaper. I clipped it from the newspaper archives. It was in the Boston Post, I believe, in 1905. I think it was 1905 and not the 1906 fight. But that's a young Jeanette. Look at that baby face. He's still got those big cheeks. Look at him. He's so cute and ferocious. It's like a bear. You're like, oh, he's so cute. Oh, he ripped my head off.
Man,
just like Greb,
something else.
He weaponized his cardio. Jeanette could go all day. He could be knocked down, but as far as stopping him, the one time Langford stopped him, he said it was by accident. And he said that Jeanette did something stupid, jumped into the punch. You know, like that's how hard Jeanette was. That the hardest puncher of his generation, Langford, thought it was an accident when he did not stop him, because that's how many times he clocked this guy with no effect or no lasting effect. Jeanette was fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Would it be fair to say, guys, that in terms of ring generalship, it's a tie? Like Greb and Langford approached the fights much differently, but they both were absolute master they were field marshals out there in the ring. I have it a tie personally. I'd be interested to see what you guys think.
Well, I'll say this, if I can jump in and say this. When you look at the Bayonne Globetrotter, Jeff Smith, here's a man who fought just about all over the world. Jeff Smith, and he faced Harry Greb 7 times. Jeff Smith was one of the greatest middleweights who never won a title. I have Jeff Smith. I have Mike Gibbons, Harry Greb. They're in my top 10. So when you look at fighters like this, and he's fighting these guys over and over again, he's taking on these competitions month after month after month. A phenomenal fighter was Harry Greb. That's why I have him ranked number 2 behind Sam Langford, because of what Sam Langford has accomplished, the amount of time he was in the ring. So both these men are parallel in terms of their tenaciousness. BL nailed it on the head when he talked about punching power, goes to Sam Langford. When he talks about activity, goes to Harry Greb. I think that's correct. But when you look at the combined efforts of both men, I would have to say if Sam Langford was given the opportunity that Harry Greb got, I think he would have had, if not similar opponents, but he would have probably dominated as well.
Yeah, and shout out to BL. I know you've given me permission, but yeah, I didn't think you mind if I clipped a couple of screenshots here.
That's a wonderful stat. Very nice.
You have my permission, buddy, whether I'm here or not, to use any of my material for whatever you need. It's all good.
I appreciate it, brother. Now look at this. I know that I don't know if anyone's joined the hall or if there are different modifications, and I assume this counts Jack Blackburn is in there as a coach. But look at that, 724 rounds against men in the Hall of Fame. That is, to my knowledge, that's the absolute, by far and away, the number one number of rounds known, right, BL? He's the top of that list, by far.
Actually, Sam Langford, in my database, has fought more title fight rounds than any fighter in history, more rounds against champions, and more rounds against Hall of Famers than any fighter in history. No fighter beats him on them. He has, I believe, if I recall, the highest number of knockouts against Hall of Famers in my database. I believe he has the highest number of fights. Mistaken. He has, yeah, he's got that
over Hall of Famers.
He's got the highest number of fights against Hall of Famers in my database. This is counting Harry Greb as well. Sam Langford tops loads of my more fights against champions than any other fighter in my database, more title fights than any fighter in my database. When you look at the statistics, I've got over 1,200 fighters in my database, and Langford tops multiple statistics. One thing that Greb actually beats Langford on is wins over Hall of Famers. He actually beats him on wins over Hall of Famers, even though he has less fights. Langford's 30, 19, and 17, I think, and Greb is 32. 32, is he 30, 33, 10, and 4, something like that. Can't remember offhand, but aside from that, in stats, Langford dominates Greb in most of them, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think some of those, like the draw against McVeigh in Paris, now I'm not rewriting the record, but the draw against McVeigh in Paris was an unpopular one. The draw against Walcott in 1904 was an unpopular one. So,
to be fair,
Langford had a lot of draws.
For Greb as well. The second Tony fight were unpopular against Greb and certain other fights.
That was a travesty. Compared to the way the press rated that fight, scored that fight, it was a travesty. It was like a blatant, like just a corrupt home cooking travesty. But yeah, so both these men, the draws, they both fought in an era with more draws than today. Especially Langford fought in an era where a lot of his fights early in his career are ref's decision. There are no judges. So at the end of the fight, the ref raises one guy's hand or calls it a draw, and they had their own ways of looking at it. So he won more rounds against Walcott, but got a draw.
Scrap mentioned a really good point earlier, though. He highlighted a really good point earlier that a lot of people need to consider as well. I don't know if everyone caught on it, but when Scrap mentioned that in Langford's early era, there were way more prearranged draws. The prearranged draws weren't really happening like that in Greb's era.
Yes, correct.
To that extent. So that is a really good point Scrap made earlier that I think needs re-highlighting. Langford did have prearranged draws. Some fights it'd be a draw even if he won. You know, he fought in that era. He fought in the Walcott era, where Walcott. I've studied his career. I've gone through newspaper archives. I've read reports of his fights. And when you look at Barbados Walcott's kind of established career as people have it now, you have to knock 9 of those defeats off and 7 draws off, and actually put him on his win column, because he was battering the guy and scored a knockout, and it was called off, and it was called a draw, or he battered the guy senseless for 8 rounds, and then it was called a draw, or it were arranged that if he didn't get a knockout, you know, it'd be a automatic win to other guy, like against Kid Levine, who were a hell of a fighter. But you know, this is the kind of era, and I think that is a really good point Scrap mentioned earlier when he was doing his initial talk, I believe, that Langford fought in the era of pre-arranged draws, and if he hadn't fought in that era, a whole number of Langford's draws would more than likely be wins, which would improve his record massively.
Certainly, there were fights where even the ref who gave it a draw acknowledged that he won more of the rounds, like with Walcott in 04.
Great points. And again, when Sam Langford faced Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Charlie White was the referee. One of the greatest referees of all time, in my opinion, is Charlie White. But he didn't allow Sam Langford to knock out Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. He stopped the contest. And it wasn't a knockout. But these are the type of things. And BL, you have said it, and you're 100% times that I've heard you say it, where Sam Langford and Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, they would go into arenas and they could only go by themselves. They were not allowed to even have a corner man in their corner. And so when you look at all these factors, you have to put those factors in as well as the mindset of the fighter going into that particular fight.
I'm trying to remember to showcase Langford's ear off. I'm trying to remember a young prospect that Barbados Walcott fought. What did Dick Flynn? Dick Sis. I'm trying to remember.
Was it the middleweight Dick O'Brien? He was a popular Boston fighter.
He fought this rising prospect, this kid. And in first round, Walcott took it easy on him. But then in second round, he started unloading on him, launching his customary brutal two-handed assaults. Because he could fight a number of ways, Joe Walcott. He was very clever. But sometimes he'd box and move and throw these leaping left hooks that were very accurate, actually, and he'd throw booming overhand rights. And if they caught you, you were in trouble. Just ask Choyinski. But at other times, he wouldn't try and land these big shots moving in quickly. Sometimes he'd just go after you with brutal two-handed assaults. And he went after this kid, and this kid was so petrified, he kept going to the floor. Every time Walcott opened up with both hands, he kept going to the floor. He was just scared to death. He'd felt power, and he just didn't fancy, being lent against ropes, taking a two-handed assault off him. And after he went to the floor about 7 times, referee waved it off because kid would not get off the floor. And the referee called it a draw. It's like, okay.
There's definitely some extra adversity going on that these guys. Can I mention something? So you mentioned Langford fighting across multiple generations. Like, part of the reason his career is so pivotal, especially among all the pre-rating era fighters. So he fought at the weights he was at and sometimes above them. He fought like the top fighters from before he even started, right?
Yes.
Jack O'Brien was already a factor before he debuted. Jack O'Brien's 1902 is one of the great, in my opinion, one of the great seasons of all time, especially, across any weight, just a fantastic, but hugely busy. But anyway, so Jack O'Brien, Barbados Walcott, Joe Gans, Elbows McFadden, he's fighting guys, Patsy Sweeney, he's fighting guys who were top factors in the 1890s. But often, like Gans and Walcott, were still absolute world class. They were the top of the game, the food chain, in the early 1900s, but they had already been around. Young Peter Jackson had been around. You guys know this better than I do. Jack Johnson had been around. He's fighting all these like just killers. And then he's fighting the guys who came up around his time. Dave Hawley debuted at January 1st, 1900. Another hugely busy schedule. So he's fighting like Dave Hawley, and he's fighting the guys coming up around him, including like guy who was in the amateur tournament at the weight class above, Johnny Johnson. He fights him couple months into his 1903 season. Then he's supposed to fight Elbows McFadden, who was a very powerful fighter, but a little bit on the downside. Got put off till next year when they did finally meet. Just schooled him. Apparently McFadden only who was touted as America's greatest blocker, but apparently he only landed 2 light punches in their whole fight. He got saved in the first, and then the second, Langford put him to sleep for 2 minutes. So like Langford, he was fighting top guys who had been around. He was fighting I'm getting off track, but he was fighting the guys who were coming up around him. And then he fought probably a generation and a half more. So like, the breadth of time that his career spanned is just astounding, considering he stayed dangerous so late because of that power and that chin and that toughness and the experience. Like you could break your hands on the top of his head. He weaponized his short stature and his power and his long arms the way Greb weaponized his creativity and his cardio.
Well, to put it another way, if you could imagine, thinking about it another way, different fighters, different styles, but a similar thing in terms of stature. If you think about it, if you had a young fighter who's 17 years old, fights Roberto Duran, when he's undisputed lightweight champion, right? Fights Roberto Duran, and then only less than a year later fights Sugar Ray Leonard at welterweight, and then only 2 years later, well, about 1.5 years later, fights Mike Tyson.
That sums it up.
He goes on
you
to have
fought the lightweight champion, you fought a welterweight champion, then you fought a heavyweight champion. And if you think in that time as well,
of top fighters who won't face him, so he's beating a who's who among the guys who are willing. But it's funny. It's almost like he was underrated by some and feared by others. And as he got into his prime, the ratio of people who underrated him diminished compared to the people who feared and avoided him. So then it became less guys, more fights. McVeigh, Jeanette, later Wills, battling Jim. These monsters compared to him. But
and let's not forget the great Jeff Clark as well.
That's right. I've got a graphic of the Joplin Ghost here. He was a top fighter. Yeah. And he was also a top. Guys would bring him in. I think it was Tommy West brought him in for one of his training camps. I think it was Jack Johnson was in the camp as well, getting him ready for some fight on the West Coast. But
Jeff Clark, the one who slid like a phantom across the ring.
Yeah, and Langford, his people they didn't want a big ring against Jeff Clark. So you're talking about one of the greatest ring cutters of all time. Didn't want to fight Jeff Clark in a big ring. You know how good he was at moving.
Well, they said Jeff Clark could move around the ring like a ballerina effortlessly. Very, very good mover. Very good with his feet. Very good range control. Excellent jab. Excellent jab. A great fighter. When Langford first fought him, he'd had over 100 fights. He was a very experienced fighter. I mean, to me, Jeff Clark, it's almost criminal that this guy's not in the Hall. To me, I don't even think he's on ballot to join the Hall, if I recall. It's good to see. We're at Lou Bogash, joint list of potential inductees. But yeah,
wow.
Langford fought Johnson, Walcott, Gans, and then the next generation came in when they were going to heavyweight. The Jeanette McVeigh, Jeff Clark, Harry Wills, and then towards the end of that period, went next generation, the Meehan's, the Fultons, the Norfolks, the Flowers, the Godfreys. Like I said, I don't think, even though Greb fought across multiple weights and fought across a range of, to me, Greb just can't match that. In fact, in the matchup, even though I love Harry Greb to pieces, I love his whirlwind attacking style, his refusal to, he didn't even take a defeat badly. If he got beat, well, he'd kind of take it badly in a way. He was just so competitive that, I lost. Well, I want to fight you next week then. Can we fight tomorrow? Can we fight now? I love that about him. I love his crazy style, how guy kept hitting him with jabs, so he grabbed his wrist and bit his glove and he wouldn't take his teeth out. And, because he were annoying him because he kept hitting him with jabs. From all these other things, I just can't pick him over Langford in most categories we've talked about.
I think that's fair. And partly because Langford, objectively, it just seems like he had a tougher career. There was more danger there for him, more size disparity. He was fighting more knockout punchers. He had long series against greats of his generation, like long series. I mean, he fought McVeigh the first time. McVeigh debuted to my knowledge, in 1902, right? The same year Langford did. There's actually one of the results of one of Langford's fights right below it.
Yes.
In the article, they're mentioning right below it. Oh, thanks, Scrap. In the article right below Langford's blurb for winning a fight, they're saying, top rising heavyweight out in California, Sam McVeigh is making waves, and someone discovered him. I forget who it was. They said discovered him, but like Langford, they didn't fight until 1911. They fought twice in 1911, 4 times in 1912. I can't remember if they fought once or twice in 1913, but they ended up having 15 fights. That was just one of Langford's long series. Jeff Clark, Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette. He's fighting. Battling Jim, not as good a boxer, but Battling Jim was a giant ball
But
of
very
muscle and
tough
just
and
hard
durable
charging.
and heavy-handed and very big,
Right.
heavy guy, up to 240 pounds sometimes.
Right.
So a big, durable, strong guy who, would use his physical strength to sap your energy and maul you. And he very heavy-handed as well. People look at Battling Jim and they get deceived by looking at his win-loss ratio, but they don't realise the insane level of opposition that guy fought. He fought Willses and Langfords and everyone else over and over again. So, people criticise him for defeats, but how many of them were he knocked out? Not too many of them, really. He was a very durable fighter. He could fight rounds. I mean, yeah, the fight with Johnson were very quiet, received a lot of criticism because they say they didn't really put too much effort into it. But ultimately, these were big, strong guys. And like I said, Greb did have fight runs, long fight runs, like Scrapbook alluded to, with Smith, Gene Tunney and Loughran and Gibbons and many, but the fight runs were not as long and brutal as Langford's. Because Greb were fighting a diverse set of styles, yes. He were fighting clever boxers like Loughran and Tunney. He were fighting guys who could fight forward or backwards, fighting in a crouch. Jeff Smith, he could pick you off and time shots at you as you came in. Other times he could come forward and move into you, working body and head. Very, very clever, very tough fighter. So he fought a myriad of styles, but to me, the fight runs were not as brutal as Langford's fight runs, because I've often said McVeigh's fight runs, because I've often said, well, Langford, in McVeigh's probably fighting, aside from himself, prior to Wills coming along and Dempsey, he's probably fighting pound for pound, maybe the hardest puncher in boxing, because he was a heavyweight, McVeigh, and he was a brutal puncher. Yes, Jeanette could punch very hard as well, but I don't think Jeanette hit quite as hard as McVeigh. I think Jeanette were a better blend of movement, good jab, durability with knockout power. But in terms of brute force trauma, blunt force trauma, probably McVeigh, aside from Langford, is probably the hardest puncher in the sport. He's like the Ernie Shavers of his time. When you look at his record, he's knocking all these guys out. I saw footage on YouTube, Facebook in a private group, and it were old footage of McVeigh, and they were both stood in the corner, and they were in middle of the ring, and McVeigh had a towel over his shoulders, and the other guy did, and they were talking to each other, smiling in middle of the ring. They went back to the corner, they came out, McVeigh stood there, came forward, threw one right hook, and hit this guy clean, and this guy just collapsed like a tree. That were it. Boom, fight over. One punch. And when you look at McVeigh's record, the number of early knockouts is staggering. He's blowing people away in a few rounds, a lot of them. So for a small guy to fight such a powerfully built guy like Sam McVeigh all those times, it never gets any easier. It probably gets harder because your opponent starts to learn your rhythm, your timing, your reflexes, they know your movements, how you're going to place your feet, the kind of tactics you're going to use, what are your favorite punches, do you like to parry, do you like to come forward with lead punch? They'll learn you. It's like I said, Ali's third fight with Frazier wasn't easier because they'd fought twice, so they knew each other. The fight was harder because they did know each other. They knew each other down to ground. They'd shared those 27 brutal rounds prior to that fight. So I think the fight runs, even though Greb had tough fight runs, I just don't think they're as tough as Langford's.
And you know what's amazing about these two men? Randomly show the image with Battling Jim Johnson and Jack Johnson. Well, Sam Langford faced both men. Jack Johnson gave Battling Jim Johnson a heavyweight championship title shot in 1913. But Sam Langford is saying, wait a minute, I fought this man 15 times, defeated him 3 times with no decisions. So where's my title opportunity? That goes to show you the quality of a fighter that Sam Langford actually was. And he had to fight in Paris several times in different areas of the globe just to try and get opportunities. But Sam Langford knocked on the door with the majority of champions. He was told no, but he deserved an opportunity at the title shot and never got one. And it just goes to show he put all these guys that we talked about in the room of a Jack Johnson and didn't get the opportunity. So that's why I say it's kind of difficult, because we don't know because he didn't get the shot. But based on what we know of Sam Langford, it looks like he would have had a pretty good chance. He faced Philadelphia Jack O'Brien in 1911 and defeated him. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien was a light heavyweight champion. So it just goes to show you And what he did to Stanley Ketchel, and in 10, and he was going to get another opportunity before he was shot by Walter Dipley, unfortunately for him. But it just goes to show you that Sam Langford was the goods. He had the opportunities to fight not championship fighters, but men who were en route to championship fights. And he defeated the majority of them. So it's just unfortunate he didn't get the opportunity. I believe he would have came out well.
Yeah, I'll tell you something, Scrap, as well about that, the Ketchel Langford fight. You know, there's so many stories about that fight, but a number of them I did a deep dive on that fight. And in one of them, it said Langford at times, because people said, oh, Ketchel gave him a furious battle, it was tooth and nail. But actually, a lot of fight reports I were reading is Langford were catching his shots and countering him with stiff shots, and he was smiling in clinches. Langford, apparently, to a lot of people, were taking it easy on him. Langford had been told before a fight, well, you won't get your rematch next year if you wipe him out. So, you know, don't wipe him out and knock him unconscious. But then I read an interview, I can't remember the name of Ketchel's manager at the time, but it were a few weeks after the fight. I was doing this big trawl through Langford archives, and Ketchel's manager started talking, oh, well, we may not go Langford next year, we may go another direction. Because apparently they didn't like what they saw in the fight, and they thought in a 15-round fight, they weren't too keen on whether Ketchel could beat him or not. And Ketchel's manager, I wish I should have downloaded that article and copied it. But Ketchel's manager were basically talking, saying, oh, yeah, we don't know what direction we're going. So it already seemed like after that fight and display they saw, they were not that keen on maybe going with Langford fight for middleweight title. I've always been at mind that after reading those articles I were reading after that fight, I'm not sure that they gave him that shot. I think they'd have walked away from it, to be honest, and gone somewhere else, like most of the champions did in Langford's time.
I think you might be right. I mean, they would only agree to fight 6 rounds in a no decision city,
right?
You know, with the hope that if everything went quote unquote well, they would get the big fight. But like Langford called him out as soon as he won the middleweight championship. Langford was there. Ketchel's people drew the color line, then raised it to fight Jack Johnson, and then so they did end up fighting. Credit to Ketchel fighting Jack Johnson and Sam Langford, even if it was under certain circumstances. But Langford was a terror. He had seen it all. I made this graphic. This was some of his notable opponents leading up to the fight with Bill Lang in early 1911. Just look at you guys know all those people he's been in.
Yeah, McFadden, Holly Gans, Walcott,
Andy Watson, Walcott, Big Sandy Ferguson, who wasn't
Jeanette Johnson,
a top heavyweight in the world,
Sandy
but he was
Ferguson.
the best guy in New England. He was the best guy in New England. And
that's a good
Kubiak, Iron Haig, Dixie Kid, Mike Schreck. Mike Schreck was supposed to be a test, but he came in a little bit heavy and he got run over in a round. Or I think
Langford destroyed him.
Start the second, or if I'm not mistaken, Clark battling Jim Ketchel himself, fireman Jim Flynn. I mean, to
me, Ketchel would have fought Langford again, because Ketchel didn't really fear anyone, but I don't think his management would have let the fight happen. I think they'd have talked him out of it. I think they'd have told him to. Yeah,
Ketchel had guts. He was a serious dude. So you may be right on that thing, but the color line was just like today's money line. People, you're not a big enough draw, or I want 80-20. So they ask for something untenable. It's just an excuse because people aren't ready, or they never intend to, or don't intend to yet face certain top opposition. So guys get frozen out for different methods.
If I may as well, I'll just say, because I once years ago had a furious debate with this guy, and I was telling him no. He was like, no, Ketchel could beat Langford. He could out. I'm like, no. I'm sorry. I respect Stanley Ketchel as a fighter, but the fighter I saw get rocked and battered by Billy Papke is not going 15 rounds with Sam Langford when Sam Langford is going for the knockout. If Sam Langford is going for that knockout against Stanley Ketchel, I highly doubt Ketchel goes that 15 rounds. I really highly doubt it.
So one of the reports I read on that. Oh, sorry, Scrap. I just want to say one of the reports I read on that said Ketchel was tired, and they only fought 6 rounds. So if he was tired after 6, Langford fought a 20-round fight against Barbados Walcott's brother Belfield 2 weeks after his first loss to Danny Duane. He fought, I think that was over 12 rounds maybe, but 2 weeks later he fought his first 20-round bout in his first full season. So if Ketchel's tired after 6 and Langford's so much better those years later, no, maybe it wasn't the best move. You notice I use this photo, BL. I usually don't use this one because you use it a lot on your channel, but I put it up special for this talk.
Brilliant photo. What were you going to say? Sorry, Scrapbook.
Yeah, sorry, Scrap.
No, I was going to say Stanley Ketchell's manager's name was Willie Britt, and you're absolutely right. He was in negotiations with Sam Langford, and he was always given an excuse as to why he felt that fight shouldn't take place. So when the agreement was a 6-round fight the first time and the second opportunity a title shot, I don't think that would have happened anyway. Unfortunately for Stanley Ketchell, we didn't get to find that out, but I don't believe he would have fought faced him the second time. Although he did, it was in negotiations, part of getting him in there for a 6-round event, but I don't believe he would have. His manager, I believe, was very doubtful that Stanley Ketchell would have had a shot in a world championship fight.
It's worth noting, as great as Jack Johnson was, in the papers, Langford was the hardest hitter. They were saying, not Johnson, they were saying Langford was the hardest hitter since Fitz. Johnson not accepted. Like he was the guy. So like Ketchell fighting Johnson, yeah, it's a huge danger. But Johnson liked to play with his food. Langford didn't. Sometimes he did, but like if he had a point to prove, Langford could be wickedly destructive, and he had more power, more concussive power, because of his fight style and the way he was set low than Johnson. So like a long fight against Langford would have been a horrific thing. But maybe he would have gotten it on. Ketchell had a giant set on him. It's not to question his fortitude, but like maybe they didn't like the risk compared to the money. Maybe there was easier money, and so they were thinking of the other direction. But that was Langford's problem, was he was too good. So even when he would hold back on guys, people knew. He even said in one interview that he would try to finish guys with a straight right instead of his left hook because he didn't want to over advertise, because he said the press were always celebrating his right. Like early in his career, the press celebrated his very educated lead left, his jab, but like later in his career, around like 1910, 1911, they were going on about his straight right. And he said he didn't want to dispel that illusion because he had that left hook. That was actually his money punch. So it's interesting. Like he did everything he could to try to not seem as dangerous as he was, but people saw right through it. And you couldn't hurt the guy. He was just invincible. They would just, guys said that. Lang said that. I'm not sure. Maybe Iron Haig said it too, but a bunch of guys, they just glanced right off the top of that flat head.
I think as well, it's worth noting that in Greb's career as well, he also had an aurora that scared away a heavyweight champion at 1920s, Jack Dempsey. By whipping Brennan, Meehan, and Gibbons easier than what Dempsey could. Like Gene Tunney said when asked about it, when Greb were furiously negotiating, trying to get a fight with Carpentier, and Carpentier were made massive money offers to fight Greb, and he wouldn't. Greb chased a fight with battling Siki. That fight couldn't happen. He were chasing Berlenbach, he were chasing Delaney, he were chasing a whole number of fighters, but the fight he really wanted was Jack Dempsey. And, like Gene Tunney said, when asked, what do you think happens in Greb and Dempsey? He just said basically, well, Dempsey will beat Carpentier and he'll make Dempsey look foolish. I mean, Gene Tunney's verdict was, well, Greb will just make Dempsey look foolish. Just too good.
It's too hard to, he's too creative. And someone like Dempsey was an amazing hooker, right? One of the greats in that realm, but that can't be your main tool. And then you're going to fight this, like, that's like bringing a one-stringed, like playing a saw with a bow. And someone else, you're in a guitar battle with Steve Vai, like you can't do it. Like Greb had such a huge toolkit and speed and cardio. I think he would drown a lot of guys, even great fighters. He'd be able to fluster them because he was so, like, lots of great technical fighters admitted that he just wouldn't.
You see, one of the things about it, and Scrapbook will be aware of this, but Langford and Greb, they enjoyed fighting big men. I mean, it was Greb who said, I enjoy fighting big men. They get in their own way, meaning I like fighting a much bigger man because they fall over their own feet, they're slow, I'm too quick for them. And, in sparring with Dempsey, that's what Greb were doing. He were moving on outside with his jerky movement, hands down, but you can't hit him, you can't tag him, time him, because he's just constantly moving, bobbing, moving, constantly. Left, right, in, out. And then he'd bound in, fire punches, and then he'd go out. And they always said that Dempsey's counter hooks were just hitting empty air. Greb were already gone, but time Dempsey through his hooks. And, famously, someone said, Greb will whip Dempsey. Dempsey just can't catch him. Now, a 15-round fight is very different to, you know, a 3 or 4 round spar, but, you know, Greb could maintain that pace, not only for 3 or 4 rounds, he could maintain that pace for 20 rounds, pretty much, like he did against Ratner, like he did against many other fighters. So, you know, really, they
the
both
late
could have
Tommy
been.
Dix said the same thing, the similar sentiment he was saying about Dempsey. He wasn't sure about over the distance of a whole fight if he could catch him, but stylistically, Greb would be so tough. You know, Greb
Yeah,
was
I have
just,
a
he was
question
brilliant.
for you, gentlemen.
Yeah, go on, sorry, Scrapbook.
No, I just want to ask you guys a question.
Please.
Which fight would you rather see? Or what do you think would be more compelling fight? Sam Langford and Harry Greb, or Harry Greb and Stanley Ketchel?
Harry
Langford,
Greb
Greb
and
for
Sam
me.
Langford.
Yeah, for me, that's on another level. Although I gotta say, Sam Langford and Archie Moore, for some reason, I feel like that would be one of the greatest fights of all time. Like Archie when he wasn't too ancient, when he was had his full experience, but when he was the young old, before he was the old. You know.
I mean, can you imagine? I've always had this, and people say, "Oh, yeah, he wins by knockout." Rocky Marciano. I'm like, Rocky Marciano, Sam Langford fight. I thought, well, Rocky really would have to show how tough he was, because Langford wouldn't load the kitchen sink on him. And if he thought Charles would have rough fight for 15 rounds and then 8 rounds, and Walcott would have rough fight for 13 rounds, he's going to have a nightmare fighting Sam Langford, because Sam Langford not only has the speed and power to hit really hard and maintain his punch power for 15 or 20 rounds, Rocky has a major fight on his hands in that one, because Sam Langford is a few inches shorter than Rocky, yeah, but Langford has speed. He's got brutal punch power. You know, the same Rocky who were dropped by Walcott and Moore could also be dropped by Langford. You know, could Rocky wear Langford down? I don't think so, because Langford fought long fights with big, powerful, hard-punching guys who were very physically
tons of
strong.
20-round fights at different
Yeah,
weights. So he was used to dealing with even more power than his own, you know, physical strength, maybe.
People were Rocky have the romanticism of saying, because I had another guy saying, "Oh, Rocky Marciano would knock out Harry Wills." I'm on about because Harry Wills lost to Jack Sharkey. I've seen it on YouTube, and I'm like, that's Wills years past his prime. The Wills from 1917-21 was a way different proposition to that. He was way quicker. He was in his athletic prime. He was destroying Ole Anderson, Denver Ed Martin, Fulton, Gumbo, you know, beating Langford back to beating Jeff. I mean, in one fight, Wills was chasing Jeff Clark around that ring, and Jeff Clark had to use, they said, all the reports were saying the same thing. Wills were like a machine. Basically, Clark had to use every defensive savvy he had to survive that fight. Wills were on ferocious form. So, you know, these people who say that these guys had beat these guys easy, I think they really need to look at all the fighters a bit better. I've always said that, you know, because someone said to me, "What do you think, Marciano, Langford?" I'm like, I'm sorry. I respect Rocky. Tremendous fighter he was. He did great for being a short guy, but he's fighting a guy who's used to fighting power punchers who are bigger than Rocky, bigger physically than Rocky, who have massive endurance and solid chins, and he can hold his own and he can win them fairly easily for the most part. So, you know, I don't think he has anything to fear from Rocky. You know, look at Jack Dempsey. I mean, you know, his opponent didn't show for one of his fights. So an old Joe Jeanette got in the ring and said, "I'll stand in and fight Mr. Dempsey." And Jack Dempsey and his handlers got out of the ring. They wouldn't even fight an old Joe Jeanette. So, you know, do we think Dempsey would fight a younger Sam Langford around 17, 18? I know Dempsey wanted a title yet. He was fighting God knows how many 4-round fights he had. He all seemed to be doing his fighting 4-rounders. You know, while Langford's having 15, 20-round wars against heavyweight Hall of Famers. Dempsey started out, sorry, I'm being a bit critical, but it drives me a bit crazy because people compare careers in wrong ways. You know, and, you know, do we think Dempsey would... He clearly didn't want to fight Greb. He clearly also said later he didn't want to fight Sam Langford. He wouldn't have wanted to fight Sam Langford. So, you know, these fighters, like, you know, to a fighter who many say is one of the great heavyweight champions, they had him kind of running in a way. He didn't want to fight any of them. He didn't want to fight Wills. He won't fight an old Jeanette. He won't fight Langford, he said by his own admission. And he clearly turned his back 3 or 4 times, especially when he went to Europe and then came back from fighting Harry Greb. So that shows how great these two fighters are when legendary fighters from their own era avoid them. And, you know, Greb would avoid it, but Langford would avoid it.
Like Greb was past his best, and so was Langford. you know, being avoided. Like Greb was a hugely experienced veteran with all these world-class wins, trying to get a title shot, like on a decision. With Wilson, it's like he had far better resume than any of the people he's fighting. Including the champion when he fought him. It's just, but for me, like when they get past their prime and they're still doing it. Whether it's out of desperation or drive or both. Just the fact, like one of Greb's greatest wins got to be that Walker win. Fight's an all-time great. He's past his best. He's already fighting a busy schedule, and then go ahead a couple weeks later and beat Maxie Rosenblum so completely that the Slapsy Maxie is born. He like starts to change his style out of tribute and becomes one of the most elusive fighters
modeling
ever.
himself on Harry Greb.
Customato said that Maxie might have been the cleverest fighter he ever saw. That's high praise from a guy of Cuss's age.
Actually, there were another fighter who said that Harry Greb was the greatest fighter he'd ever seen. And that was a guy called Billy Conn. And Billy Conn had seen Sugar Ray Robinson and he'd seen Henry Armstrong.
That's right.
And he said Harry Greb was the greatest fighting man he'd ever seen in a ring. And he'd seen these great fighters.
Yeah, that's very true.
Absolutely.
He did say that. Yeah,
with guys like Gans and Dixon and Walcott, Langford, and certain of these greats, later generations greats, look back and go, that was the guy. Just like today, the heavyweights, they might talk their smack, but they got to tip the hat to Muhammad Ali because they're not fighting his schedule. They're not trying to fight every top guy in the world and prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt, whether they're the underdog fighting away from home. They're sitting back and make money on social media, so they got to tip their hat. Or certainly any historical enthusiast should. Like, compared to these careers, Muhammad Ali didn't have a lot of fights, but you've done great work on this, BL. Both you guys have. Yeah, he packed in so many top fights, just like Jimmy McLaren packed in so many great fights. And then McLaren was another guy too said Greb was the best ever, right?
Wasn't that Jimmy McLaren said Greb were. He said, if you thought I was great, you should have seen Harry Greb.
Right. I'm pretty sure that's what the sentiment Benny Leonard had about Joe Gans.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Joe Gans. Yeah. Now, it's an interesting point that you say. Oh, go on, sorry, Scrap.
No, I'm sorry, BL. I was just going to point out the man in the middle with the cigar. Jimmy DeForest, one of the most brilliant men in boxing history.
Mm-hmm.
He was phenomenal.
Yeah, legendary figure, wasn't he?
Amazing. Yeah, he inspired Harry Wiley Sr. to become a trainer because Harry Wiley Sr. was a man just wrapped hands.
Oh, you were a legendary. Yeah, Harry Wiley Sr.
You said Wiley Sr. used to wrap Langford's hands, among others?
He did.
Do I remember that correctly?
He did. Joe Jeanette, all of them. Yeah. Yes, he did.
You know what else? The fact that, like, on Langford's behalf, Langford and Greb, they both have a pile of legends who think they were the greatest. Maybe just for their size, not in absolute terms at times, but like Blackburn, where he wanted Joe Louis to be as good as Langford. I mean, that's some of the highest praise you can get because you're talking about a brilliant fighter who went on to be a genius of a trainer. And if he's trying to take his protege to Langford's level, then that tells you something because Blackburn saw. I know he was in jail for a few years, but he saw it all. He saw everything in his time in the sport. So if he's looking back at Langford,
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I was going to say Jack Blackburn, when Joe Louis lost in 36 to Max Melling, Jack Blackburn brought Joe Louis to Sam Langford and had him have a talk with him, settle him down, and explain things to him. That's how much respect he had for Sam Langford.
Yeah, because
it was also, I think, Jack Blackburn who at one point said, because I think it was Jack Blackburn. Someone were talking to him about Joe Louis, and it were earlier in his title reign. He said something along the lines of, "Yeah, Joe is fantastic and he's developed really well, but he said he's nothing compared to black fighters of my era, the black heavyweights of my era." He said. He's meaning Johnson, Langford, Jeanette, all these guys. He basically said at that point in Joe Louis's career, this were long before he did the 25 reign and the, near 12-year lineal reign. But earlier in his title reign, Jack Blackburn said, he's developing very well, but he's not on the level of the black heavyweights of my era. He actually said that Joe Louis wasn't on their level.
Also,
which
it's
is
about having access to great opponents. That's just circumstance. So it just so happened that in Langford's time, there were so many great heavyweights fighting busy schedules. Even Johnson, before he had unified the color title and the until then white title. Like before then, he was very, very, very busy. So was Dempsey, in fact. In the lead up to it, once he got the championship, a lot of guys slowed down. But in the lead up to a championship, a lot of these guys fought a hectic schedule, even if they later stopped doing so. But Blackburn, he was busy too. And he had a lot of fights off the books. We don't know how many fights he had. He may have had 100 or more beyond what we know of, but we know he had a bunch of fights. He was brilliant and he passed that along, but he passed along the old school filtered through the prism of his understanding from all of his personal experience. So Joe Louis was like an upgrade of a throwback. But he had that stance, he had that shuffling style, he had that parry counter, he had that bang into the body, he had that coming upstairs over the top. Once you get them thinking of the body, he had all the tools, and he was very strong. And so Joe Louis stood out in part because he had access to this wealth of knowledge through Jack Blackburn on all that had been learned, and that's something they don't have today. You can't just go get a Jack Blackburn level coach who's fought as many legends in the coaching world today. There's nobody who has fought had a personal career on the level of Jack Blackburn. So you literally can't find someone to teach you who's seen what Jack Blackburn saw in his many fights. So Lewis had an advantage, and Langford had Bob Armstrong. He had Jimmy Walsh too, and they sparred even though there was a size disparity. But like he had Bob Armstrong and George Byers. He had champion level fighters coaching him. It's a big advantage, you know. So it's life's not fair. Some guys do have opportunities, but on the other side, Langford was denied opportunities within the sport, even though he had a good support system, support structure around him coming up. So there's a bit of irony there, you know. He had in a different framework, Langford would have been so incredibly celebrated all throughout the generations because of his ability.
just if I may, just while I think on to give you and Scrap. I don't know if Scrap's ever seen this in his research or his information he has, but I read a massive article in the newspaper. It was in 1938. And this guy was comparing Joe Louis to the past great heavyweights. And it were a fantastic article. It covered like 2 full pages. It were a full page spread. It had pictures of these heavyweights on, Joe Louis in middle, the heavyweights, and then a write up on what he thought would happen in the fight and whether Joe Louis could beat these heavyweights. Now, get this: it named the heavyweights John L. Sullivan, James Jeffries, Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney, Jack Sharkey. No mention of Wills, Langford, McVeigh, Jeanette, none of them. All ignored.
Yeah,
just showing the time they fought in. Not one of them would even consider.
Today, BL, like I've seen in like big channels videos where they're saying never fought for a championship, and in the same video they say fought for the color world title or something. They phrase it slightly differently. It's like, look, if you look at the fighters that are competing for the colored world titles, those are every bit as much a world title as the other title, and the people in their day, the press in their day, wanted them to unify the titles.
Yeah, because back in the day, the people who consider that, and reason I've always considered colored titles world titles is because the media in their day referred to them as title fights. They said they're fighting for the colored heavyweight championship.
That's right.
It was actually referred to like that in the media.
World champion. And
they were recognized as champions now. They had the black heavyweight title. They had the colored heavyweight title. Sometimes they'd face off against each other. But I still say to this day, the best heavyweights of that entire era were the black heavyweights: Johnson, McVeigh, Jeanette, and Wills and Langford. And, Dempsey does not match them. Burns and Hart do not match them. Jeffries did not. Jeffries was a great heavyweight in his own way. At least he fought some black fighters like Griffin, Armstrong, etc., and later came back and fought Johnson. But none of the white heavyweights at that time did what they did. And none of the white heavyweight champions at that time can even compare to those guys. Those guys were the premium heavyweights of their era, and Langford fought all of them nearly 50 times. And that is something that even Harry Greb cannot match.
Yeah, the danger and the fact that he was the little guy of the group. I mean, he got pretty heavy later on, but it was fat heavy on top of his frame. You know, like he was the little guy of the group, and it was a scary group. You know, just like again to mention Muhammad Ali, he wasn't the biggest heavyweight of his era. He wasn't the hardest hitter. He had plenty of finishes, dozens of finishes, but that was cumulative. You know, he knew how to flurry. He had his sense of his ring generalship. Oh my goodness! But I think, other than Ali's era, this is the other richest era of heavyweight boxing, in my opinion. I mean, because these guys are so busy. Like this, I've pulled this up in multiple chats, and I'm going to pull it up again because it took forever to type this out in order. This is 1 year. This is 3 heavyweights in 1 year. This is Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh in 1911. Johnson didn't fight this year. He was coming off the big Jeffries mega payday. So he was racing cars, doing what he was doing. But that's what they did between the three of them. You don't see that even in Ali's era. They weren't fighting that much. I don't think you could find 3 guys to do that in a year at the high level.
No, nowhere near that much. Ali's era, they'd already gone to 3, 4 fights a year if they're top level. Sometimes 5 fights a year at a push, but not many.
Yeah. But at the same time, Ali's era was incredibly rich. It was a different structure, different sporting architecture, but that's an incredible era, the decades he fought through. But this era has its own arguments to be the richest, in part because the guys were fighting actual seasons of the sport. You do the season of boxing, then you regroup and you might start early the next year. But I've seen them discuss the seasons. At the time, there weren't as many major sports. And so this was a season of, like, if you fought once in a year, you're halfway retired. You took a break. Whereas today, if you fight once in a year, fans might complain, but they're not. Like, you're practically retired. You were expected to do a lot. So these guys, no one got a world title shot off of this, but there were fights for the colored title in that mess. And then different years, Langford fought for the English title, Australian title. They fought for the Australian title, the Commonwealth title, or like they had these different things. They were fighting for honors. They were fighting good opponents. So I tend to look at the belts. Like, I take interest in the structure of the belts, but I really just look at the opponents. Like Harry Greb, when he beat Gene Tunney, the first fight, when he thrashed him, that was for the America's light heavyweight title. Well, that win is worth more than almost any proper full world title at that weight in history, in my opinion, considering what Gene Tunney did in and around that particular bad loss. It wasn't for world titles, so if you say, oh, world championship, no, it was just for the America's title. But yeah, but that's Harry Greb giving Gene Tunney his only loss on the books. He gave him another one in spirit, but we won't get into that too much.
Well, guys, I don't mean to run, but my throat now, as I explained before we came live, my throat is now going really dry. I keep having to mute because I'm coughing. My throat's really dry. So I think I'm nearly done. My throat can't take much more, I'm afraid.
No shame in that. My throat is raw too. But the last thing I'll say is, like, people get the idea that that boxing back then, it was like archaic, but there are guys today who thrive on spreading a little chaos. Even if they know how to do it a more formulaic style, they choose to do it. There were a lot of really great stylists by this time. There was already a rich lineage, great stylists by the time that Langford hit his prime, by the time Greb hit his prime, especially. But they were involved in big fights. Like, this is the crowd for one of Langford's fights with McVeigh in Australia. A big deal. I think it was about 15,000 people. It's a serious thing. These weren't small fights. These were like carried in the papers. Even if it was in certain countries, these guys were celebrity athletes because there wasn't as much sports going on. Boxing was a big old deal. But I don't want to prolong it too much longer. I just can't thank you guys enough. I found my other cache of graphics here, so I'm trying to run through them while we close the show out. There's Langford in Lewis's camp.
Can I just answer a thing in the comments? A few people have mentioned Rumi's Corners doing his top 10 fighters by decade. It's a shame, but when I were going to take a break from doing videos, I scrapped a video I had. It were going to be an hour long. And I did my own. I had my own top 10 fighters by decade. So it's a shame I never did that. But the project I mentioned to you before we went live, that's going to take some focus now. I'm going to tone down videos a little bit. will I
That's a
get that
wonderful.
cooking?
Oh, that's a wonderful idea, though. And I love all the projects you guys are doing. I'm just enjoying it all so much. And, I think so. I don't know if we can call it between the two careers. I think we agree that Langford's career may be a little tougher. I've had more numericals, like a ratio of success, but Langford fought an era with more draws. So maybe all in all, like it's almost a toss up. I mean, I have Langford just slightly ahead of Greb because of the highest level work and the grueling fight series, but really, and smaller gloves, less rules, so there's more uncertainty, more adversity, but it's really close. And
I
I
think
do believe these are the greatest of all time. These guys.
I think the way I see it is that both fighters are great fighters with great resumes, and what Harry Greb achieved were incredible. I just think Langford edges him in most of the departments, except the overall activity crammed in a short time. The length of fight runs, being a bigger puncher, being a bigger weight mover, fighting way more fights against opponents giving away disadvantages, even though Greb fought a lot of opponents giving away disadvantages. He didn't quite match Langford. And I find when we've been talking about a lot of different aspects of it, like Scrapbook mentioned a good point, in his first 4 years fighting Gans, he's then going straight into Walcott and Hollies and Blackburns and everything else. A quicker start. Yeah, Greb had that incredible run of 3 years, over 100 fights, with only one established defeat. Well, his next defeat came, to Gibbons. He ended that massive unbeaten run. Harry Greb's record, 45-0 a year, having to wait nearly 230 fights to get a title shot. The champion being, lamparded and called a yellow belly in media because he won't fight him, and people not wanting Wilson to fight anywhere because until he mans up and fights, he's mandatory. Shame they don't do the same thing now with these fighters who avoid mandatories. But yeah, it's I find in most of categories, I don't know what Scrap thinks, but I find in most of categories, Langford edges him. He just edges him in most things.
Yeah, BL, I would say Sam Langford traveled more than Harry Greb.
Yes, great point.
Yeah, the opponents that he faced, he had to travel abroad sometimes to get some of those fights. So I think Sam has an edge on that as well. That can wear you down traveling like that. You didn't have planes. You
God,
had to
that is
take
a great point,
steamboats
Scrap,
and things
actually.
like that. So that's something to
Panama,
consider as
Cuba,
well.
France, Australia,
Yeah.
England, everywhere. Yeah, that is a great point. I hadn't thought of that in all this discussion. That is spot on point. Is that? Yeah.
And I think also Langford, because he fought later in life, he fought at a greater disadvantage, yet he was still giving up big size and fighting at the highest level. So like they both fought at the high level in the latter part of their career, but Greb wasn't around long enough to get as far past it as Langford, I think. Especially as Langford lost a little bit of his drive, like especially Willard's the champ, and he knows he's not getting a shot now. So, but he soldiered on. He needed the money. It was the only thing he knew how to do. But like I pointed out before, his 1920 comeback of sorts. He'd been blind in one eye for 3 years at this point. He'd been a Cyclops, and he still won most of those fights. What a brilliant fighter and tough as nails. Both these
Langford called out Willard, but after Willard had to establishment at time who were controlling colour line and didn't want black fighters getting the shots, after Willard had deposed Jack Johnson, there was no way they were going to let Jess Willard fight Sam Langford or fight Harry Wills or fight any of them guys. To me, I've always said I like the fact Johnson laughed in establishment's face because they deserve to be laughed in the face. Yes, it was a very dangerous tactic he used, ribbing establishment. But when I fully agreed with his stance on it, laugh in the face and beat up all the contenders. We're not subhuman. We can beat you. So I applaud Jack Johnson for that attitude with establishment, even though, like I say, we're dangerous. But once Willard got that belt off him, there was no way. I think Jess Willard would have been shot rather than climb into a ring with Harry Wills or Langford. I think someone would have put a bullet in him before letting him do that.
He barely fought at all. Didn't he just fight once in between getting the title and like the several years that led to him losing it?
Yeah, very inactive. Yeah. And the certainly
I don't want to be overly negative, but
it.
Not a very good. I wouldn't rate him very high amongst the champions, even though he beat the guy who had unified the colored and that iteration of the colored and the white title, but and then beat Jeffries, although it was years later, beat the lineal champion. So I mean, so he just didn't do a lot. You know, Dempsey did great things on his way. The knockout of Fulton especially was beast mode, and you know, Wills shared that win. Fulton was winning other than those two fights. So it's like, you know, a knockout artist like Fulton, and then these guys are smashing him. They can't get that fight together. You know, the reluctant champions. So when I do my all-time ratings, when we did the heavyweights of the first quarter century of the 1900s, I had Dempsey number 6, I believe, which is still pretty high considering everyone who fought in that time, you know, all the great resumes. But I didn't put him up. Some people have him up at the top. I had him number 6 in that quarter century, which is pretty awesome, but that's what the resume can get him to. Because he had the opportunity to do more. He just chose not to. He was doing other things. Same with Willard. He was doing other things. That's fine. But like in analyzing the sport in that context, he was a pretty crap champion. You know, Langford, Wills, these guys were fighting really tough opponents for those titles. So at times the colored championship was worth more in a sporting sense. It was harder to get and keep. Like, because I don't see, I'm pretty sure even an older Langford would probably spank Wills, like 1915 Langford. Like, if Will's next fight was Langford after the Johnson fight, I don't like that fight for him. Big, tall guy, big, tall, lumbering guy, fighting the hardest hitter of his generation. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, it's a hard task. Langford could reach your chin, even if you were a 6'6", because he could have built it and he could reach Will's chin as well. Yes, he had trouble with Fulton. But that's a Fulton, not in 1915. That's a Fulton later when Langford's left his prime. 1915, I still think Langford would have knocked out Jess Willard. He might have had trouble reaching him, but he'd have caught him. He'd have got him at some point.
He would have banged him in the body too. You know, he said he would crowd guys.
He'd have bullied him to ropes like he did many other big fighters.
He'd say if they didn't lead, I'd rush, you know, bully them to the ropes, and if they'd lead, I'd counter the body. He would just work. He'd work him over because he had the power and he had the chin, and he was also set really low. He didn't have to duck to be set low. Like just briefly about that Rocky fantasy fight you mentioned earlier. See, Rocky said his whole style, because of his short arms, he had to get underneath the guy, right? Come up into them. Well, Langford is considerably shorter than Rocky. So how's Rocky going to get underneath the guy who's like, whatever, 3 inches shorter than him or however much shorter he was, but who has way longer arms? I think that particular matchup, even though Rocky was great, I like that fight for him. I'd give Archie Moore a better shot against Langford because of his combination punching and his savvy and his angles and things like that. I don't like Rocky's chances. Like after he threw, when he's getting ready to throw his next punch, Langford's going to hit him with that short power. When he's off balance momentarily, he's going to punish that in a way that other guys may not. Oh, BL, you got booted. You're back though. Welcome back, man.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking at comments. I pressed the wrong button and it ejected me. Yeah, I am going to have to go now, guys. I'm really struggling now. My throat is...
Scrap, you still there? I'm sorry, brother. I went on a giant rant. This has been so much fun. And thanks to the guys in the chat. I'm going to listen back and read the chat because you guys have been talking away. I haven't answered hardly anything. I didn't want to hit the wrong thing and, you know.
Yeah, that's what happened to me earlier. I hit the wrong button. I got booted off. I want to say thank you very much for you, Random, for holding this platform. BL, thanks for the suggestion of having this conversation. It was a pleasure as always, and we have to continue because I think we bring out some great points, and we're keeping this thing alive, and that's very important. So thank you so much for allowing me to be on this platform, speaking about this conversation that we all adore.
Yeah, anytime, my friend. You know, I'm always up for a conversation, and you know, thank you for all the work you do for all the boxing fans and the great content you put out. Like Scrapbook alluded to there, you know, by having these conversations, we're keeping the names of these fighters alive. We're trying to keep the names relevant. We're trying to educate people on who these fighters were, the times they lived in, the careers they fought, and that's really important, as I'm sure Scrapbook will agree.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Oh, sorry, Scrap.
No, Random, you go ahead. I was just saying absolutely. And BL, great work you're doing. Random, great work you're doing. And we got to continue. Absolutely.
Yeah, and hopefully we can do another one of these within 2 or 3 weeks. Sometime to our within our convenience, we can do another talk or something. There's just so much rich history. I'd love to get 86 back on. with us in some kind of conversation that would be manageable with 4 voices, 4 people. But this has been superb. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to call it myself because I've actually been sitting on the porch. It's a little bit cold here in the Northeast. So I'm actually I can't feel my fingers. So I think it's a good time to go have a hot coffee and read back the chat. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, BL. Thank you, Scrapbook. Check out Hardline Boxing Talk and Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs. I'm Random Acoustic Thoughts, and we are out of here. Take care, everybody.
Peace, everybody. Thank you to the chat.
Peace.